A poor 19-year-old girl steps onto the richest farm in the West, and the most powerful man in the frontier gives her only one day to prove she deserves to stay. But what he didn't expect was that this girl with nothing would change his life forever. Today's story will make you laugh, make you cry, and make you believe that sometimes the most precious things in life cannot be bought with money. Watch until the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how my story has progressed, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. The mare stumbled twice on the last stretch of road before Eliza pulled her up short and sat there, breathing hard, staring at what lay ahead. She had expected something big. Everybody in Ridgewater County talked about Iron Ridge Ranch the way they talked about weather or death, like it was just a fact of the landscape, something too large to argue with. But talk hadn't prepared her for this. The gate alone was wider than her mother's entire house, built from timber so thick it could have held back a river. Beyond it, fences ran in every direction until they dissolved into the pale grass of the foothills, and somewhere past the barns and corrals and outbuildings, the main house sat against the ridge like a small fortress, its windows catching the last copper light of a spring afternoon. Eliza wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She could feel the dust in her teeth, the sweat dried stiff along her collar, and the dull ache in her lower back from riding since before dawn. The mare, borrowed technically from Mr. Hadley at the feed store in exchange for 3 weeks of sweeping his floors, shifted beneath her, equally tired, equally unimpressed. "All right," Eliza said to the horse. "Don't embarrass me." The mare flicked one ear. Eliza nudged her forward. She was 19 years old. She owned one dress that wasn't patched, a pair of boots that leaked in rain, and a recipe for sourdough bread that her mother had written on the back of a seed catalog page 7 years ago. Her father had been dead since she was 12, thrown from a horse that spooked at a rattlesnake, a stupid death that had turned their already modest life into something closer to survival. Her mother, Clara, had kept them fed through laundry work and mending and sheer force of will, until 6 weeks ago when the coughing started. At first, Clara had waved it off. "Just dust," she said. The way she said everything was just dust, just tired, just nothing. But the coughing didn't stop. It got worse. It got wet. And then one morning, Eliza found her mother on the kitchen floor, too weak to stand, with blood on her lips and a look in her eyes that scared Eliza more than anything she had ever seen. Not fear exactly, but resignation. Like Clara had already started the slow business of letting go. The doctor in town, Dr. Phelps, who smelled like whiskey and whose hands shook before noon, had examined Clara and delivered his verdict with the bluntness of a man who had stopped caring about bedside manner sometime around the end of the war. "She needs rest. Real rest. Medicine. Better food than whatever you've been feeding her. And someone to look after her properly, which means you need money, Miss Rowan. And I don't see how you're going to get it." He wasn't wrong. Eliza had already taken every job she could find in Ridgewater, washing dishes at the hotel, mucking stalls at the livery, helping Mrs. Calloway with her garden for 50 cents a week. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. And so she had done the one thing that nobody in their right mind would do. She had ridden 26 miles to ask Silas Ashcroft for work. Everybody knew about Silas Ashcroft. He was the richest man in the territory, maybe the richest man between St. Louis and San Francisco, depending on who was telling the story and how much they'd had to drink. He ran 12,000 head of cattle across land that stretched from the Blackwater River to the edge of the Painted Hills. He employed 47 men, owned interests in 2 mining operations and a railroad spur, and had once, according to legend, bought an entire town's debt just to settle a grudge with the mayor. He was also, by every account Eliza had ever heard, a miserable son of a gun. Not mean, exactly. Not cruel, just hard. The kind of hard that comes from building something enormous out of nothing and then discovering that enormous still feels empty when you eat dinner alone. His wife, Margaret, had died 8 years ago, pneumonia, the same winter that killed half the cattle in the valley. And since then, Silas had poured himself into the ranch the way a drowning man grabs at driftwood. He worked before dawn and past dark. He fired men for small mistakes. He spoke to his foremen in sentences that rarely exceeded 5 words. And he had not, as far as anyone could remember, smiled since approximately 1869. Eliza knew all of this. She rode through the gate anyway. The yard between the gate and the main house was almost comically large, a hard-packed expanse of dirt and gravel that could have held a cavalry parade. To her left, a long row of bunkhouses sat low against the ground, smoke drifting from their chimneys. To her right, a massive barn with double doors stood open, revealing the dark shapes of horses inside. Chickens scattered as she passed. A dog, some kind of hound, bony and serious, watched her from beneath a water trough, but didn't bother to bark. A man was leaning against the corral fence, rolling a cigarette. He was maybe 30, sun-darkened, with a mustache that needed trimming and a hat pushed so far back on his head it seemed to be defying the basic principles of hat-wearing. He looked up as Eliza approached, and his eyebrows climbed. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Ashcroft." The man's eyebrows went higher. "You are?" "I am." "You got business with him?" "I'm looking for work." There was a pause. The man looked at her, really looked, taking in the borrowed horse, the patched dress, the dust, the youth of her, the obvious poverty, and then he started laughing. Not unkindly exactly, but with a genuine amazement that made Eliza's ears burn. "Work," he repeated. "Here." "That's what I said." "Sweetheart, this is Iron Ridge Ranch. We don't exactly—" "Don't call me sweetheart." He stopped laughing. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, but a flicker of interest. The way you'd look at a barn cat that suddenly swiped at your hand. "Fair enough," he said. "Name's Walt Brennan. I'm the head wrangler, and Mr. Ashcroft doesn't hire women." "Has he told you that?" "He hasn't had to. No woman's ever asked." "Well," Eliza said, swinging down from the mare with as much dignity as someone with saddle-sore legs could manage, "now one has." Walt studied her for another moment, then shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've decided something is going to be entertaining regardless of how it turns out. "Main house, front door, knock loud. He's probably in his study, and he keeps the door shut. Don't take it personal when he says no." "Thank you." "You're welcome." "And miss?" She turned back. "Good luck. You're going to need about 10 years' worth." The main house was something out of a fever dream. Eliza had seen drawings of fancy houses in catalogs. Big places back east with columns and parlors and rooms that served no purpose except to prove the owner had money. But this was different. This was a frontier mansion, built from stone and timber, solid as a fort, but with touches that spoke of someone who had once tried to make it beautiful. There were curtains in the windows, though they were faded. A porch that wrapped around two sides, though several of its boards were cracked. Flower boxes that were empty. A door knocker shaped like a bull's head that was green with tarnish. She knocked. Loud, like Walt said. Nothing. She knocked again. The door opened so fast she almost fell forward. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same stone as his house. Silas Ashcroft was maybe 50, though the years sat heavy on him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was all jaw and cheekbone, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. His hair was iron gray, cut short, and his eyes were the color of creek water in winter, pale and cold and not even slightly interested in whatever she was about to say. "What?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was more like a door being shut in word form. "Mr. Ashcroft, my name is Eliza Rowan. I've come from Ridgewater to ask about work." "No." "I can cook, clean, mend, tend horses, keep accounts." I said no. "And I'll work harder than any man you've got on this ranch." Silas looked at her the way he might look at a fence post that had suddenly started talking. There was no anger in it, no contempt, just a flat, absolute disinterest that was somehow worse than either. "Miss Rowan," he said, "I have 47 men on this ranch. I have a cook, 2 stock managers, a head wrangler, and a foreman who's been with me since before you were born. I don't need help. I especially don't need help from a girl who looks like she rode here on a prayer and a borrowed horse." "The horse is borrowed," Eliza admitted. "The rest of me is mine." Something happened in Silas's face then, a twitch, barely visible, at the corner of his mouth. It could have been irritation. It could have been something else. He looked past her at the yard, at the fading light, at the 26 miles of empty trail she would have to ride back in the dark. "You rode from Ridgewater?" "Yes, sir." "Today?" "Left before dawn. And you plan to ride back tonight?" "If you say no, I suppose I'll have to." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "You can sleep in the house tonight. Spare room at the end of the hall. Tomorrow morning, you ride home." Mr. Ashcroft, that's the offer, Miss Rowan. Take it or take the road. She took it. The spare room was larger than her entire house. It had a bed with a real mattress, not a straw tick, an actual mattress, and a washstand with a porcelain basin and a window that looked out over the valley. Eliza stood in the middle of it for a full minute, afraid to touch anything, before she sat down on the edge of the bed and felt the mattress give beneath her, and almost cried. She didn't cry. She had made a decision somewhere around age 14 that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had mostly stuck to it, with occasional exceptions involving stubbed toes and the anniversary of her father's death. Instead, she washed her face, hung her spare shirt on the back of the door, and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was a disaster. Not dirty, exactly, more neglected, like a room that had been used every day without ever being cared about. The stove was caked with old grease. The pots hanging from the ceiling rack were tarnished black. The pantry was stocked with enough food to feed a regiment, but most of it was stored carelessly. Flour open to the air, sugar half spilled, dried beans scattered across the shelf, like someone had given up halfway through putting them away. There was a thick layer of grime on the windowsill, and the table where meals were apparently prepared had a gouge in its surface deep enough to hide a coin. The ranch cook, she learned later, was a man named Harlan Potts, who had been feeding the Iron Ridge crew for 6 years and whose primary qualification seemed to be that he was willing to do it. His meals were functional, heavy on salt pork and beans, light on anything that required actual skill or affection, and he resented any suggestion that they could be improved the way a dog resents being told it can't sleep on the furniture. But Harlan wasn't in the kitchen that evening. Nobody was. The crew had already eaten. She could see the evidence, a stack of tin plates in the sink, a pot of something gray and cooling on the stove, and the house was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like holding your breath. Eliza rolled up her sleeves. She started with the stove. It took her the better part of an hour, working with lye soap and a scrub brush she found under the sink, but by the time she was done, the iron gleamed and the kitchen smelled like clean metal instead of old grease. She organized the pantry next, sealing the flour into proper containers, sweeping the shelves, arranging the provisions in a way that made sense. She scrubbed the table, the windowsill, the floor around the stove. She washed every dish in the sink and stacked them properly. Then, because she was there and the kitchen was clean and her mother's voice was in her head saying, "You never enter someone's house without leaving it better than you found it," she made bread. She used Clara's recipe, the one on the back of the seed catalog page. It was simple: flour, water, salt, a bit of sugar, the sourdough starter she'd been carrying in a small jar in her saddlebag because she never went anywhere without it. She mixed the dough by hand, kneaded it on the clean table, shaped it into 2 round loaves, and set them near the stove to rise while she finished cleaning. By the time the bread went into the oven, it was past 10 o'clock. The house was silent except for the tick of a clock somewhere in the hallway and the occasional creak of old timber settling. Eliza sat in a kitchen chair and waited, and without meaning to, she fell asleep. She woke to the smell of bread and the sound of footsteps. Silas Ashcroft was standing in the kitchen doorway, wearing a rumpled shirt and suspenders and an expression she couldn't read. He was staring at the stove, then at the pantry, then at the table, then at the bread, which was cooling on a cloth on the counter, golden brown and cracked across the top, the way sourdough does when it bakes right. "What is this?" he said. Eliza stood up, smoothing her dress, trying to look like she hadn't just been asleep in someone else's kitchen at 5 in the morning. "I made bread." "I can see that. Why?" "Because the kitchen needed cleaning, and it seemed a waste not to use it once it was clean." Silas walked to the counter. He stood over the bread for a moment, then tore off a piece. He chewed it slowly. His face didn't change. Not one muscle moved, but he tore off another piece and ate that too. "Who taught you to bake?" "My mother." "She any good?" "She's the best cook in Ridgewater County. Was before she got sick." Silas set the bread down. He looked at Eliza, and for the first time she saw something behind the coldness in his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but a crack in the wall, a place where light might eventually get through. "One day," he said. "Sir? You get one day, today. If you can prove you're worth something to this ranch, you stay. If you can't, you ride home tonight. That's the deal." Eliza straightened her shoulders. "What do you want me to do?" Whatever needs doing. I'm not going to hold your hand, Miss Rowan. Figure it out. He took the rest of the bread and walked out. The first thing Eliza figured out was that Iron Ridge Ranch was, beneath its impressive exterior, slowly falling apart. Not structurally, not financially, but in all the small ways that happen when a household has no one paying attention to the details. The porch boards she'd noticed the night before were worse than she'd thought. 2 of them were soft with rot. The flower boxes weren't just empty. Their brackets were rusted, one hanging at an angle that suggested it was one good storm away from taking someone's head off. Inside the house, curtains were moth-eaten, furniture was dusty, and an entire parlor, a beautiful room with a stone fireplace and wide windows, had been closed off, its door shut, a thin line of dust along the threshold suggesting no one had entered it in months, maybe years. She started with what she knew. She went to the barn, found tools, and spent the first 2 hours of daylight prying up the rotted porch boards and replacing them with planks. She cut from lumber stacked behind the barn. The work was hard, harder than she'd expected, and she hit her thumb with the hammer twice and split her lip when a board kicked back at her. But by mid-morning, the porch was solid and level and no longer trying to kill anyone. The flower boxes came next. She climbed a ladder to detach the brackets, brought them down, cleaned off the rust with sand and vinegar from the kitchen, and reattached them straight. She didn't have flowers, but she found some wild sage and yellow prairie grass growing along the corral fence and planted clumps of it in each box. It wasn't elegant, but it was alive. By then, the ranch hands were starting to notice. A few of them drifted past on their way to morning tasks, checking horses, moving cattle to new pasture, hauling water, and each one slowed enough to stare at the young woman on the ladder with grease on her hands and sage in her hair. Most of them said nothing. A couple exchanged looks. One older man with a beard like a bird's nest stopped his horse and watched her for a solid minute before saying quietly, "Huh," and riding on. Walt Brennan found her around 11 when she was in the kitchen again, up to her elbows in dough. "So you're still here," he said from the doorway. "He gave me a day." "I heard. I also heard you cleaned the kitchen last night. Harlan's not happy about it." "Harlan's kitchen was a health hazard." Walt grinned. "You might not want to say that to Harlan." "Is Harlan the kind of man who gets offended easily?" "Harlan's the kind of man who once threw a skillet at a horse because it looked at him wrong. So yeah, I'd say he's got a short fuse." Eliza considered this. "I'll make him a pie." "A pie?" "People who throw skillets at horses are usually people who haven't had a good pie in a long time." Walt laughed. A real laugh, sudden and surprised, and shook his head. "Miss Rowan, you are either the smartest person I've ever met or the craziest. Haven't figured out which yet." "Could be both." "Could be." He leaned against the door frame. "Listen, I don't know what you think one day is going to prove. Mr. Ashcroft, he's not a bad man, but he's been running this place like a machine for 8 years. Everything by the numbers. No room for anything that doesn't fit the ledger. And you," he gestured at her, encompassing the flower on her face, the patched dress, the sheer improbability of her presence. "You do not fit the ledger. Maybe the ledger needs updating. Maybe. But that's not your call to make." He was right, and she knew it. But knowing something and accepting it are different things entirely, and Eliza Rowan had never been much good at accepting the way things were when she could see how they ought to be. She cooked lunch, not just any lunch. She cooked the kind of lunch that makes men stop talking mid-sentence and look down at their plates with an expression usually reserved for discovering gold in a creek bed. She used what was in the pantry. There was plenty, just badly utilized, and made a proper stew with beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, and a gravy so rich you could have floated a horseshoe in it. She baked cornbread to go with it, using the last of the buttermilk she found in the cold cellar. She made the pie she had promised, apple, from a barrel of dried apples in the pantry, with a crust that shattered when you pressed a fork into it and a filling that was sweet and tart and spiced with cinnamon, she found buried behind a sack of rice. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, served from a long table that could seat 30. When Eliza carried the food over, she had to make 4 trips, and her arms were shaking by the last one. The men looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that she was starting to recognize as the default expression of anyone encountering her on this ranch. Then they tasted the stew. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest, but the quiet of 30 men simultaneously realizing that they had been eating Harlan Potts' cooking for 6 years and had apparently forgotten what real food tasted like. Spoons scraped bowls. Cornbread disappeared. The pie lasted approximately 4 minutes. A young hand named Billy Cortez, who couldn't have been more than 16, looked up from his empty plate with an expression of profound wonderment. "Ma'am, where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My mother." "Your mother's single?" The table erupted in laughter, and even Eliza couldn't help smiling. "My mother is ill, which is why I'm here." The laughter faded. Billy looked embarrassed. "Sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean—" "It's all right. She'd have liked the compliment." An older hand, the bearded man who'd watched her on the ladder that morning, spoke up from the far end of the table. "What's your name, miss?" "Eliza Rowan." "You planning to stay?" "That depends on Mr. Ashcroft." "Well," the bearded man said, picking up his second piece of cornbread, "if he's got any sense at all, he'll chain you to that kitchen stove." That's not exactly the arrangement I was hoping for. More laughter. She could feel something shifting in the room, not acceptance, not yet, but a softening of the edges. These were men who worked hard and ate badly and didn't expect much from life beyond a paycheck and a bunk and the occasional Saturday night in town. The idea that someone might care about what they put in their mouths was genuinely novel to most of them. Harlan Potts did not attend lunch. She found out later that he'd been in the barn, sulking, which was apparently his preferred response to any disruption of his routine. She saved him a plate anyway and left it on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "The stove cleans up easier now. Hope you don't mind." She didn't know if he'd read it. She didn't know if it mattered. What mattered was the afternoon. She spent it in the house, working through the rooms one by one, not overhauling them. She didn't have the time or the right, but tending them. She beat dust from curtains, polished furniture with beeswax she found in the pantry, washed windows until the late afternoon light came through clear and gold instead of gray. She didn't touch the closed parlor. Something about that shut door felt deliberate, and she had enough sense to know that some rooms stay closed for a reason. But she noticed things. She noticed that the hallway had framed photographs on the wall, but several of them were hung crooked, and the glass on one was cracked. She noticed that the dining room table, a massive thing, built from a single slab of oak, was set for one, with a single plate, a single glass, and a single set of silverware at the head, and that the rest of the table was bare. She noticed that Silas's study, whose door was slightly ajar, had books stacked on every surface and an oil lamp that was smoking because the wick needed trimming. She trimmed the wick. She straightened the photographs. She didn't touch the place setting. At 5 o'clock, she went to the stables. The horses were magnificent. Silas Ashcroft didn't skimp on his livestock, whatever he skimped on elsewhere, but several of them were restless, pacing their stalls with the nervous energy of animals that hadn't been properly worked. She talked to them the way she talked to all animals, which was the way most people talk to children, softly, directly, without condescension. She checked their water, their feed, their hooves. One mare, a beautiful roan with a white blaze, had a stone bruise that nobody had noticed. Eliza cleaned it, packed it with a poultice of mud and dock leaves, and wrapped it carefully. Walt found her there, kneeling in the straw, the mare's hoof in her lap. "You found Penny's bruise," he said. "How long has she had it?" "I don't know. She's been favoring that leg for a few days, but I thought she just stepped wrong." "It's a stone bruise. Not bad, but if you leave it, she'll go lame." Walt crouched beside her and looked at the poultice. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father was a horseman, before he died." She lowered the hoof gently and stood up, brushing straw from her knees. "He wasn't a great horseman. He wasn't great at much, but he knew hooves." Something in her voice made Walt look at her differently. Not with pity, which she would have hated, but with the recognition of someone who understood that most people on the frontier carried their losses the way they carried their tools, always within reach, always a little heavy. "Your mother," he said. "She bad? Bad enough?" "And you rode 26 miles to ask a man who fires people for breathing wrong if you could work in his kitchen." It seemed like a good idea at the time. You know what? It might have been. He stood up, dusted off his hands. "Dinner's at 6. You cooking?" "If there's food to cook. Pantry's full. Harlan just doesn't know what to do with any of it. Harlan and I are going to have a conversation." I'd pay money to see that. Dinner was roasted chicken, 3 of them from the coop behind the barn, with mashed potatoes, green beans from a jar in the cold cellar, fresh bread, and gravy. She made 2 more pies because the first one had disappeared so fast she suspected some of the men hadn't gotten any. She set the bunkhouse table properly, with plates facing up instead of stacked in the middle, and she put out salt and pepper in a dish of butter, which apparently qualified as a revolutionary act because several of the hands stared at the butter as if they'd never seen it before. She carried a plate to the main house for Silas. He was in his study, behind a desk covered in papers, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up when she knocked. "Dinner," she said, setting the plate on the one clear corner of his desk. He looked at the plate, then at her. "You've been busy. You told me to figure it out. I told you to prove you're worth something. I didn't tell you to reorganize my entire household. I didn't reorganize it, I just cleaned a few things. Your house is—" She stopped herself. "My house is what, Miss Rowan?" She met his eyes. "Your house is beautiful, Mr. Ashcroft. It deserves better than dust." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable, and then he picked up his fork and cut into the chicken. He chewed, he swallowed, he cut another piece. "Sit down," he said. "Excuse me? There's a chair. Sit in it." She sat, confused and slightly alarmed, in a leather chair across from his desk. Silas ate in silence for 2 full minutes, working through the chicken and potatoes with the focused efficiency of a man who had been eating alone for a very long time. Finally, he set down his fork. "Your mother's sick." "Yes, sir." "How sick?" "The doctor says she needs rest and medicine and better food. She needs someone to look after her. And that someone is you. There isn't anyone else." "What about the doctor?" "Dr. Phelps drinks more than he prescribes. He means well, but meaning well doesn't keep someone alive." Silas leaned back in his chair. He looked tired, not just evening tired, but bone tired, the kind of fatigue that accumulates over years and settles into the lines of your face like sediment at the bottom of a river. "You fixed my porch," he said. "I replaced 3 boards. You found a stone bruise on a horse my wrangler missed. Walt would have found it. Maybe. You also cleaned my kitchen, reorganized my pantry, fed my crew a meal that apparently bordered on a religious experience." He stopped. "A transformative experience. And you trimmed the lamp in my study. It was smoking. I know it was smoking. It's been smoking for a month. I kept meaning to fix it." He paused. "I keep meaning to fix a lot of things." There was something in his voice then, not vulnerability exactly, because men like Silas Ashcroft didn't do vulnerability, but an honesty that surprised both of them. He looked at his empty plate, then at Eliza, and for a moment he seemed genuinely uncertain, which was probably a feeling he hadn't experienced since the Carter administration. "1 month," he said. Eliza's heart jumped. "Sir? 1 month. Room and a board, plus wages. $3 a week. You handle the house, cooking, cleaning, whatever else you see that needs doing. At the end of the month, we'll talk. I need to send money home to my mother. I'll advance you 2 weeks' pay tonight. You can send it with the mail rider tomorrow." She wanted to say something gracious and composed, the kind of thing a woman in a novel would say, something about gratitude and opportunity and the nobility of honest work. Instead, what came out was, "Thank you, I won't let you down." "People always say that," Silas said, picking up his whiskey. "Then they let you down." "I'm not people." He almost smiled. She was sure of it this time, a fractional movement at the corner of his mouth, there and gone, like a fish breaking the surface of still water. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you are." She stood to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Rowan?" "Sir?" "The bread you made last night." "Yes?" "Make it again." She walked back to the spare room, her room, at least for now, and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Outside, the sun was setting behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the valley, and she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Horses being stabled, the low murmur of men around a fire, a dog barking somewhere far off. She thought about her mother, alone in their house in Ridgewater, coughing into a rag, trying to heat water on a stove that barely worked. She thought about the money she would send tomorrow, $6, more than she'd earned in a month of odd jobs back home. She thought about the month ahead, about proving herself to a man who expected to be disappointed, about cooking and cleaning and fixing things in a house that was grander than anything she'd ever imagined and sadder than anything she'd ever seen. She thought about the closed parlor door and the dining table set for one, and the way Silas Ashcroft ate his dinner in silence in a room full of papers and books and an oil lamp that nobody had cared enough to fix. She pulled her mother's recipe from her saddlebag, the seed catalog page, soft with handling, Clara's handwriting faded but still legible in the last of the light. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen, and started the sourdough. There was something about working in a kitchen at night that Eliza had always found steadying. The rhythm of it, measuring, mixing, kneading, was as close to prayer as she ever got. Not the asking for things kind of prayer, but the other kind, the quiet kind, where you just move your hands and let your mind settle and trust that the bread will rise because you did the work right. She fed the starter. She mixed the dough. She kneaded it on the clean table, her table now, at least for a month, and felt the dough change under her hands, going from shaggy and resistant to smooth and alive, the way good dough does when it decides to cooperate. While the bread rose, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to her mother. She didn't mention the size of the ranch or the richness of Silas Ashcroft or the fact that she was sleeping on a real mattress for the first time in her life. She wrote about the horses and the prairie grass and the flower boxes and the bread she was making and the crew of men who had eaten her cooking like it was the first good thing that had happened to them all year. She wrote, "I'm all right, Mama. I think I might be more than all right. Don't you dare get worse before I can get home." She folded the letter, sealed it with a dab of flour paste, and set it aside for the mail rider. Then she shaped the bread, set it to proof, and waited. The house creaked around her. Somewhere down the hall she heard Silas's study door close, then his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow, the tread of a man going to a bed that was too big and a room that was too quiet. She heard the creak of the floorboards overhead, then silence. The bread went into the oven. She watched through the oven door as it rose and browned, the crust splitting in the way her mother's bread always split, a long ragged tear across the top, like the earth cracking open after rain. When it was done, she took it out and set it on the counter and covered it with a clean cloth. She left a note beside it, for morning. Then she went to bed. She fell asleep listening to the sounds of Iron Ridge Ranch, a world away from everything she knew, impossibly vast, impossibly wealthy, and somehow, beneath all that stone and timber and reputation, impossibly in need of something it didn't know how to ask for. Eliza didn't know yet what that something was. She only knew that she recognized the shape of it, the way you recognize the outline of your own house when you're still a mile away, familiar, even from a distance. Even in the dark. She slept deeply for the first time in weeks, and when she woke before dawn to the sound of a rooster she hadn't known existed, she was already thinking about breakfast. The first week passed in a blur of flour dust and aching shoulders and the slow, grudging rearrangement of a household that had forgotten what it felt like to be tended. Eliza cooked breakfast at 5 before the sky had fully committed to being light. She made eggs, scrambled, fried, poached, whatever the morning called for, and bacon or salt pork, and biscuits from scratch every single day because she had learned from her mother that a good biscuit could make a man forgive almost anything, including being woken up at dawn to chase cattle across 10 miles of open range. She brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way the hands liked it, and she set out butter and preserves she'd found in the back of the cold cellar, jarred and labeled in a woman's handwriting that she suspected belonged to Margaret Ashcroft, and that she was careful never to ask about. The ranch hands ate like wolves. They came in dusty and half awake, and they sat down and they didn't speak until the food was gone. And then they spoke too much all at once, falling over each other to tell her what they liked and what they wanted tomorrow, and whether she could make that pie again, the apple one, the one with the crust that broke apart like it was made of something better than flour and butter. "It is made of flour and butter," Eliza told Billy Cortez, who had asked for the third time. "That's all a crust is." "Then how come Harlan's crust tastes like saddle leather?" "Because Harlan overworks his dough. You have to handle it gently, like something alive." Billy considered this with the gravity of a philosopher encountering a new theorem. "I don't think Harlan handles anything gently." "No," Eliza agreed. "I don't think he does." Harlan Potts remained a problem. Not an active problem. He hadn't thrown any skillets, but a simmering one. He had returned to the kitchen the morning after Eliza's arrival, found it transformed, and responded by standing in the middle of the room with his arms folded and his jaw set, and a look on his face that suggested he was calculating exactly how much dynamite it would take to return everything to its previous state. "You moved my things," he said. "I organized your things. There's a difference." "I knew where everything was." "Did you know the flower was open? Moths were getting in." "I don't have moths." "You did. I cleaned them out." Harlan stared at her with the particular fury of a man who has been doing something badly for years and knows it and doesn't want to hear about it from a 19-year-old girl who showed up yesterday on a borrowed horse. "Mr. Ashcroft hired me to manage the house," Eliza said, keeping her voice level. "That includes the kitchen. I'm not trying to push you out, Mr. Potts. I just want the kitchen to work properly." "It worked fine." "It worked. I wouldn't say fine." There was a long, dangerous pause. Then Harlan made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a growl, somewhere in the gray territory between grudging respect and active contempt, and walked out. They reached an uneasy truce over the following days. Eliza handled breakfast and dinner. Harlan kept the midday meal, mostly because the hands expected it, and partly because Eliza recognized that stripping a man of his entire purpose, however poorly he fulfilled it, was a cruelty she wasn't willing to commit. She showed him, carefully and without condescension, how to season a cast-iron skillet properly, how to keep beans from going to mush, how to make gravy without lumps. He accepted these lessons the way a cat accepts being bathed, with rigid tolerance and an air of profound indignity, but she noticed that his lunches started improving. Not dramatically, but the beans held their shape and the gravy smoothed out, and one afternoon he made a cornbread that was actually genuinely not terrible. She left a note on his counter. "Good cornbread today." He didn't respond, but the next morning she found a jar of wild honey on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before, and she understood that this was Harlan Potts's version of a peace offering, and she accepted it without comment. Silas, meanwhile, was a study in contradictions. He had given Eliza the job with the air of a man placing a bet he expected to lose, and for the first several days he treated her presence in his house the way one might treat an unfamiliar piece of furniture, acknowledging it existed without quite knowing what to do about it. He ate the meals she brought to his study without comment. He passed her in the hallway without speaking. He noticed the changes she made, the clean windows, the polished furniture, the trimmed lamp wicks. The way you notice the weather changing, as a fact rather than an event. But he was watching. Eliza could feel it. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, not the leering attention that some men gave young women, which she had learned to deflect with a flat stare and a sharp word, but with a quiet, almost puzzled attentiveness, like she was a problem he was trying to solve. The first real conversation happened on the fourth day, when she knocked on his study door to deliver dinner and found him sitting not at his desk but in the leather chair by the window, staring out at the valley with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not cold, not hard, just tired. The kind of tired that goes deeper than the body. "Your dinner, Mr. Ashcroft." He turned his head slowly. "What is it tonight?" "Beef stew, cornbread, last of the dried apples, baked with brown sugar." "You like dried apples." "I like what I can find in the pantry. If you want fresh, someone will have to go to town. I'll send Walt on Saturday." He paused. "Sit down, Miss Rowan." She hesitated. This was the second time he'd asked her to sit, and she still wasn't sure what it meant, whether it was a kindness or a test or simply the habit of a lonely man who had run out of people to talk to. She sat. Silas picked up the plate and ate slowly, which was unusual for him. Normally he ate with the brisk efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel and wanted the refueling process over with as quickly as possible. Tonight he chewed each bite as though he were thinking about it, tasting it, allowing himself the small luxury of enjoying something. "How long has your mother been sick?" he asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7. "And before that?" "Before that she was fine, tired but fine. She worked hard her whole life, Mr. Ashcroft. Harder than anyone I know." "What kind of work?" "Laundry, mending, whatever people would pay her for. After my father died, she kept us fed by sheer stubbornness. I don't think she ever rested a full day in her life." Silas set down his fork. That's probably what made her sick. The bluntness of it stung, mostly because it was true. Eliza had thought the same thing, had lain awake at night thinking it, turning it over like a stone in her hand, feeling the sharp edges of guilt that came with knowing your mother had worked herself into illness, keeping you alive. Probably, she said. You feel responsible. Don't you think I should? I think responsibility and guilt are different things, and most people can't tell them apart. He looked at her. You're here. You're sending money home. That's responsibility. Blaming yourself for your mother's body wearing out. That's guilt. And guilt doesn't cook meals or fix porches. It was the most he'd said to her at one time, and it landed with a weight that surprised her. She looked at him, really looked, past the iron jaw and the cold eyes and the reputation, and saw something she hadn't expected. Not softness. Something more complicated than softness. A man who had spent years building walls and was starting to notice, dimly, that the walls had kept out things he needed along with things he didn't. Thank you, she said. For what? For saying that. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and went back to his stew. After that, their dinners became a kind of ritual. Not every night, but most nights, Silas would tell her to sit, and they would talk while he ate. The conversations were short, practical, circling the same small set of topics. The ranch, the horses, the weather, what needed fixing, but occasionally, like a door cracking open in a draft, something more personal would slip through. He told her about building the ranch. Not the legend, not the version the men in Ridgewater told, about the fearsome cattle baron who had clawed an empire out of the wilderness. The real version. The one where he'd arrived in the territory with $40 and a wagon of tools and had nearly starved the first winter. The one where he'd lost 2 entire herds to disease before he figured out how to manage the grazing rotation. The one where Margaret had planted the flower boxes on the porch, and he'd told her they were a waste of time, and she'd told him that anything beautiful was never a waste of time, and he'd been wrong and she'd been right, and he hadn't understood how right she was until the boxes were empty, and she was gone. He didn't tell these stories all at once. They came in fragments, scattered across evenings, dropped into conversation like coins falling from a pocket. Casually, almost accidentally, as though he didn't realize he was spending something he'd been saving. Eliza listened. She didn't push. She didn't ask about Margaret, or the closed parlor, or the dining table set for one. She just listened and cooked, and when he was done talking, she would clear his plate and say goodnight and leave him in his study with his whiskey and his books and the lamp that no longer smoked because she trimmed the wick every afternoon. The second week, she turned her attention to the house itself. The ranch was wealthy enough to fix anything that broke. But wealth and care are not the same thing, and Iron Ridge Ranch had plenty of the former and almost none of the latter. Hinges that squeaked, window panes that rattled, a leak in the upstairs hallway that had been addressed by placing a bucket beneath it rather than actually repairing the roof. Eliza fixed what she could and noted what she couldn't for the ranch hands to tackle, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the house began to change, not structurally. The bones of the place were solid. Silas had built well, even in the early years when he'd had no money. What changed was the feeling. The air in the rooms grew lighter. Sunlight came through clean windows and fell on polished wood, and the whole house seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath for 8 years and someone had finally told it to let go. The men noticed too. They started coming to the main house for reasons that didn't quite hold up to scrutiny, to ask about supplies that could have waited, to report on fences that had been mended days ago, to check on horses that were plainly fine. What they were really doing, Eliza realized, was checking on her, making sure she was still there. Making sure the food would continue and the kitchen would stay clean, and the strange new warmth that had crept into Iron Ridge Ranch wasn't just a passing thing. "You've got fans," Walt told her one afternoon, leaning against the corral fence while she brushed down Penny, whose stone bruise had healed cleanly. "The boys are talking about you like you hung the moon." "I didn't hang anything, I just cooked dinner." "You cook dinner like their mothers used to cook dinner. That's different." "Is that a bad thing?" "Depends. Half of them are halfway in love with you, which is going to make things complicated." "I'm not here for complications. Nobody ever is. Complications show up anyway." She looked at him. "Is this a warning?" "It's an observation. You're a young woman on a ranch full of men, working for a man who hasn't let anyone within arm's reach in 8 years. I'm just saying, be careful. Not because anyone here would hurt you, Because people get attached, and attachment makes everything harder. Eliza thought about that. She thought about her mother's face when she said goodbye, the careful blankness that was Clara's way of not crying, and she thought about Silas eating dinner alone in his study, surrounded by papers and silence. And she thought about the way attachment and loss were braided together so tightly you couldn't grab one without getting cut by the other. "I'm careful," she said. "Good." Walt pushed off the fence. "Also, Harlan wants to know your cornbread recipe. He won't ask you himself because he'd rather eat his own hat, but he's been trying to figure it out on his own, and it's not going well. Yesterday's batch could have been used as building material." She laughed. "Tell him it's buttermilk. That's the secret, and don't overwork the batter." "I'll tell him. He won't believe me, but I'll tell him." The third week brought rain, 3 solid days of it. The kind of rain that turns roads to rivers and keeps everyone inside and drives men who are used to open sky and hard work slowly, quietly, out of their minds. The bunkhouse grew tense. Arguments broke out over card games. 2 hands nearly came to blows over a misplaced saddle blanket. Eliza responded the only way she knew how. She cooked. She made everything she could think of: pies, bread, stew, roasted chicken, biscuits by the dozens, a cake that used up the last of the sugar and most of the eggs. She brewed pot after pot of coffee. She found a set of dominoes in a drawer in the main house and brought them to the bunkhouse, along with a deck of cards that wasn't missing half the suits like the one the hands had been using. On the second day of rain, she taught Billy Cortez to make biscuits. He was terrible at it. His biscuits came out flat and dense and vaguely gray, but he was so earnest in his effort, standing at the kitchen counter with flour up to his elbows and his tongue stuck out in concentration, that she didn't have the heart to tell him they were bad. She told him they were improving, which was true in the sense that they were slightly less awful than his first attempt. "I think baking might not be my gift," Billy said, staring at his latest creation. "Everyone has a gift. Maybe yours just isn't in the kitchen." "My gift is getting thrown off horses. I'm real good at that." She smiled. "That's a useful skill in its own way. You learn how to fall." "I've learned how to fall about 40 times. "Then you're practically an expert." On the third day of rain, something unexpected happened. Eliza was in the kitchen, kneading dough, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that she recognized immediately. The door opened and Silas walked in, not with his usual purposeful stride, but slowly, almost hesitantly, as though he had taken a wrong turn in his own house and ended up somewhere he hadn't intended to be. He was carrying a basket of eggs. "From the coop," he said, setting them on the counter. "The rain's been getting in. I fixed the latch and figured I'd bring these while I was out there." Eliza looked at him. Silas Ashcroft, the richest man in the territory, standing in his kitchen with rain on his shoulders and egg basket in hand, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not attraction, not exactly. Something quieter than that. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that this man, for all his wealth and all his walls, was capable of walking through the rain to fix a chicken coop latch and carry eggs to a kitchen he hadn't entered voluntarily in years. "Thank you," she said. "I was about to go out for those myself." "No need." He looked around the kitchen, his kitchen, though it barely resembled the greasy, neglected room she had found 3 weeks ago. His eyes moved across the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the bread rising on the counter, and something in his expression softened. Not much. A fraction. Like a fist loosening its grip by one finger. "Place looks good," he said. "It was always a good kitchen. It just needed attention. Most things do." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Miss Rowan." "Sir?" "The men. They're getting restless in the rain. I can hear them from the house." "I know. I've been feeding them extra. It helps." "It does help. But they could also use something to do. There's a storeroom behind the barn full of tack that needs mending. Saddles, bridles, harnesses. It's been piling up all winter. If you could organize a work crew." "You want me to organize your ranch hands?" He gave her a look that was almost amused. Almost. "I want you to suggest it to Walt, who will organize them, because if I tell them to mend tack, they'll do it like they're being punished. But if you suggest it while handing them coffee and pie, they'll do it like it was their own idea." Eliza stared at him. "That's manipulative." "That's management, Miss Rowan. There's a very thin line. He left before she could respond, and she stood there with flour on her hands, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall, and she thought, he knows exactly who I am and what I'm doing here. He's known from the beginning. The tack got mended, all of it. The men worked through the afternoon in the storeroom, passing around coffee and the last of the pie, and by evening the saddles were oiled, the bridles were repaired, and Billy Cortez had somehow managed to sew himself to a harness strap, which required careful extraction and provided entertainment for the better part of an hour. The rain stopped on the fourth morning, and the world came back shining and new, the way it does after a good soaking. The grass impossibly green, the sky scrubbed clean, the air smelling of wet earth and possibility. The hands rode out early, glad to be moving again, and the ranch hummed with the steady rhythm of work that Eliza had come to recognize as the heartbeat of Iron Ridge. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Walt rode up, dismounted, and stood there looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "You got a letter," he said, holding out an envelope. She took it. The handwriting was shaky, shakier than her mother's hand should have been, and the envelope was thin, which meant the letter inside was short, which meant Clara hadn't had the strength to write much. Eliza opened it right there, standing in the yard with wet sheets flapping around her. 3 lines. That's all Clara had managed. "The medicine helps some. Mrs. Hadley checks on me Tuesdays. Don't worry about me, Eliza. Just do your work and be good and come home when you can." Eliza read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and went back to hanging laundry. And if her hands were shaking slightly, and if she had to blink hard against the brightness of the sun, well, that was her business and nobody else's. Walt hadn't moved. He was still standing by his horse, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine." "You sure?" "I said fine, Walt." He nodded slowly. "Okay, but just so you know, if you need to go home, you should go home. Nobody here would think less of you." "I can't go home." "Not yet. She needs the money more than she needs me sitting next to her bed worrying." "That's probably true. Doesn't make it easier." "No, it doesn't." He mounted his horse and rode off toward the north pasture, and Eliza finished the laundry and went inside and cooked dinner and served the crew and brought Silas his plate and sat across from him while he ate. And she didn't mention the letter because some things you carry alone. Not because you want to, but because carrying them alone is the only way to keep moving forward without breaking down. But Silas noticed. Of course he noticed. He had spent 8 years watching everything and saying nothing, and he had gotten very good at reading the silences between words. "You heard from home," he said. "Not a question. My mother wrote." "Bad news?" "She's managing. The medicine is helping some." Silas ate another bite. "Some. Some is better than nothing. Some is what people say when they don't want to say the truth out loud." Eliza felt a flash of anger, hot and sudden and immediately followed by the knowledge that he was right. "What do you want me to say, Mr. Ashcroft? That I'm scared? That I lie awake at night wondering if she's going to be alive when I finally ride home? That every morning I wake up in a bed that's more comfortable than anything I've ever slept in, and I feel guilty because she's sleeping on a straw mattress in a house with a leaking roof?" She stopped. The words had come out faster than she'd intended, spilling like water from a cracked jug. And now they were on the floor between them, and she couldn't take them back. Silas set down his fork. He looked at her for a long time, not with coldness, not with the flat disinterest he'd shown that first day at the door. With something else entirely. Something that looked, if she squinted, almost like understanding. "Yes," he said, "that's what I want you to say. Because it's the truth. And the truth is the only thing in this world that doesn't rot when you try to store it." The room was very quiet. The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse whinnied in the stable. "I'll increase your wages," Silas said. $5 a week instead of 3. And I'll send a man to Ridgewater to check on your mother. Not Dr. Phelps, someone competent. There's a doctor in Cedar Falls, a woman named Calloway, who actually knows what she's doing. I'll send for her." "Mr. Ashcroft, I can't." "You're not asking, I'm telling. This is my ranch, and I'll spend my money how I see fit, and right now I see fit to make sure the woman who is keeping this household from falling apart doesn't collapse from worry while she's doing it." He picked up his fork again. "That's not generosity, Miss Rowan. That's common sense." Eliza opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She wanted to argue, wanted to assert her independence, to make it clear that she was here to work, not to accept charity. But the relief was so enormous, so overwhelming, that it drowned out everything else. A real doctor. Someone who actually knew how to help. Someone who could look at Clara and tell Eliza the truth, whatever the truth was, so she could stop filling the silence with her worst imaginings. "Thank you," she said. And this time the words were heavy enough to mean something, weighted with all the fear she'd been carrying since the morning she found her mother on the kitchen floor. Silas nodded once. "Eat something. You've been cooking all day, and I haven't seen you sit down for a meal of your own since you got here." "I eat." "When?" She didn't answer, because the truth was she ate standing up, in the kitchen, between tasks. A bite of bread here, a spoonful of stew there. The scraps and leftovers of someone who was so busy feeding everyone else that she had forgotten she was a person who also needed to be fed. Silas reached across the desk, pulled open a drawer, and produced a second plate, clean, unused, as though he had put it there on purpose. He set it in front of the empty chair. "Sit," he said. "Eat. That's an order." She sat. She ate. The stew was good. She knew it was good because she'd made it, but it tasted different sitting down, eating from a real plate, across from another person. It tasted like something she hadn't had in a long time, something she couldn't quite name. They ate in silence, the two of them, in a study full of books and papers and the warm light of a properly trimmed lamp, and for a few minutes the distance between the richest man in the territory and the poorest woman who had ever walked through his gates was exactly the width of an oak desk, which is to say, not very much distance at all. The letter from Dr. Calloway arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a mail rider who looked like he'd been chewing dust for 30 miles, which he had. Eliza was elbow-deep in bread dough when Walt brought it to the kitchen, holding it between two fingers like something fragile. "From Cedar Falls," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron, took the letter, and read it standing at the counter while the dough slowly relaxed on the table, losing the shape her hands had given it. Dr. Calloway's handwriting was precise and small, the writing of someone who valued accuracy over warmth. The letter was not long. Clara Rowan's condition was consistent with a chronic lung ailment aggravated by years of overwork and poor nutrition. The coughing had improved somewhat with the medicine Dr. Calloway had prescribed, a tincture that cost more than Eliza earned in 2 weeks, paid for by a bank draft that Silas had sent without telling her. The prognosis was guarded. Clara could recover, given rest, proper food, and continued treatment. She could also worsen, if the weather turned or the stress returned or her body simply decided it had carried enough for one lifetime. The letter ended with the sentence that Eliza read 3 times. "Your mother asked me to tell you that she is fine," which is not medically accurate, but is, I gather, what mothers say. Eliza folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket with the other one, next to the seed catalog recipe that she carried everywhere, and she went back to the bread. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. She didn't show the letter to Silas. She didn't need to. Somehow, by the time she brought his dinner that evening, roast beef, the last of the winter potatoes, and bread that she had punched down with more force than strictly necessary, he already knew. "The doctor wrote," he said, not looking up from his papers. "You paid for the medicine. I sent a bank draft to cover her expenses. That's not the same thing." "It is the same thing, and you know it." He set down his pen. "Is your mother better?" "She's not worse. The doctor says that's the best she can promise right now." Doctors always say that. It's how they manage expectations. "And what do you say?" Silas looked at her. The lamplight caught the lines around his eyes, making them deeper, and for a moment he looked every one of his 50-some years and then some. "I say your mother raised a daughter who rides 26 miles to beg work from a stranger, cleans a kitchen at midnight, and fixes a porch before breakfast. A woman who raises a child like that doesn't quit easily." It was the kindest thing he had ever said to her, and he said it the way he said everything, flatly, without decoration, as though kindness embarrassed him and he wanted to get it over with as quickly as possible. "Thank you," Eliza said. "Stop thanking me." "Then stop doing things worth thanking." He almost smiled again. She was getting better at spotting it, that fractional shift at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully formed, like a match that flares and dies in the same breath. "Sit down," he said, "and eat something. There's enough beef there for 2 people, and you know it." She sat. She ate. And for the second time, they shared a meal across his desk, and the silence between them was not empty but full. The kind of silence that happens between two people who are slowly, carefully learning to trust each other with the quiet parts of themselves. The weeks turned. 4 became 5, became 6. The trial month Silas had offered passed without either of them mentioning it, the deadline dissolving the way deadlines do when nobody wants to enforce them. Eliza's wages arrived every Saturday, left on the kitchen table in an envelope with her name on it in Silas's blunt handwriting, and she sent most of it home and saved the rest in a tin she kept under her bed, alongside the letters from her mother that arrived every 10 days or so, each one a little stronger than the last. She had settled into Iron Ridge the way a creek settles into its bed, finding the path of least resistance, shaping herself to the contours of the place while quietly reshaping the place around her. The house was hers now, in every way that mattered except on paper. She knew which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck and where the afternoon light fell best. She knew the kitchen the way a musician knows an instrument, every pot and pan and spice jar mapped in her memory, her hands reaching for things before her mind had finished deciding she needed them. The crew had stopped treating her as a curiosity and started treating her as a fixture, which was both a compliment and a demotion, the way all familiarity is. Billy Cortez still asked her to teach him to cook at least once a week, though his skills had not appreciably improved. The bearded hand, whose name she'd learned was Ed Garza, and who had been at Iron Ridge longer than anyone except the foreman, had taken to bringing her wildflowers from the north pasture, which he left on the kitchen windowsill in an old tin can without explanation or acknowledgement, the way a man brings flowers when he's forgotten how to do it properly, but remembers that it matters. Even Harlan had thawed, in his way. He didn't throw skillets anymore, and his midday meals had improved to the point where the men no longer treated lunch as a test of endurance. He still didn't speak to Eliza more than necessary, but the hostile silence had evolved into a companionable one. And on rainy afternoons, she sometimes found him in the kitchen, watching her cook with an expression that was equal parts resentment and fascination, like a man watching someone play a song he'd been trying to learn his whole life. And then there was Silas. The changes in him were so gradual that you had to have been watching carefully to see them, and Eliza was watching carefully. He came to dinner earlier now, sometimes arriving in the kitchen before she'd finished cooking, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and talking, actually talking, not just issuing statements while she worked. He talked about the cattle market and the price of feed and the new rail line that was going to change everything or ruin everything, depending on which way the contracts went. He talked about the early years when the ranch was nothing but a fence and a prayer. She caught herself on that word and rephrased it in her mind. A fence and a gamble. And how Margaret had planted the first garden and how the garden had died 3 times before it finally took. He talked about Margaret. Not often and never for long, but in brief, careful sentences that cost him something each time, like a man spending coins he'd been hoarding. Margaret had loved music. Margaret had a laugh that carried across the yard. Margaret had once stayed up all night with a sick calf and named it Cornelius and cried when it died in the morning and then made breakfast for the entire crew without mentioning it. She was tougher than me, Silas said one evening, staring at his coffee. People didn't see it because she was kind. They thought kind meant soft. She wasn't soft. She was the hardest working person I ever knew, and she did it all without making anyone feel bad about themselves, which is a trick I never learned. You're not unkind, Eliza said. I'm not kind either. I'm efficient. There's a difference. There is. But you sent a doctor to my mother. That wasn't efficient. It was practical. You were distracted. Distracted employees make mistakes. Mistakes cost money. Is that really why you did it? He looked at her and she looked back, and the question hung between them in the warm kitchen air like smoke from a candle. No, he said finally. That's not really why I did it. He stood up and left the kitchen, and Eliza sat there listening to his footsteps fade down the hall, and she understood that they had crossed a line that neither of them had planned to cross, and that crossing it back was going to be harder than either of them wanted to admit. The letter from Ridgewater arrived on a Thursday. Not from her mother this time. From Mrs. Hadley, the feed store owner's wife, who checked on Clara on Tuesdays and who wrote in the rounded, careful hand of a woman who had learned penmanship from a primer and never deviated from it. Dear Eliza, the letter began, and Eliza knew from those 2 words that something was wrong, because Mrs. Hadley always wrote Dear Miss Rowan, not Dear Eliza, And the shift to a first name meant the news was personal enough to require intimacy. Your mother took a bad turn on Saturday. She fell in the kitchen and couldn't get up for some time. Mr. Hadley found her when he went to deliver the flour you ordered. She is resting now, but she is weak. The doctor from Cedar Falls came again yesterday and says the lung trouble has gotten worse. She needs someone with her, Eliza, not on Tuesdays, every day. I'm sorry to write this, but I think you should come home as soon as you are able. Eliza read the letter in the pantry, standing between shelves of flour and sugar and dried beans, surrounded by the tools of the life she had built at Iron Ridge, and she felt the floor shift under her feet, the way it does when you realize that the choice you've been dreading has arrived, and there is no more room for hoping it wouldn't. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She finished making dinner. She served the crew. She washed the dishes. She swept the kitchen floor. She trimmed every lamp wick in the house. She did all of these things with the mechanical precision of a person who knows that if they stop moving, they will fall apart. And falling apart is not something she can afford, not now, not tonight, not until she has done the thing she needs to do. She knocked on Silas's study door at 9 o'clock. Come in. He was reading, a book open on his desk, his whiskey untouched beside him. He looked up and something in her face made him set the book down immediately. What happened? My mother fell. She's worse. I need to go home. The words came out flat and steady, which surprised her because inside she was anything but flat and steady. Inside she was a river in flood tearing at its banks, looking for something to hold on to. Silas stood up. When? Tomorrow, first light. That's not enough time to... It has to be enough. She's alone, Mr. Ashcroft. She fell, and she was on the floor, and nobody found her until Mr. Hadley came with the flour. She was on the floor. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just barely. Just enough that Silas heard it and did something she had never seen him do before. He walked around his desk, crossed the room, and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the threads of silver in his gray hair and the tiny scar on his left cheekbone, and the way his eyes, which she had once described to herself as cold, were not cold at all, but were simply the eyes of a man who had practiced keeping everything inside for so long that the effort had become invisible. Sit down, he said, but gently. Not an order this time. A request. She sat. He poured a glass of water from the pitcher on his desk and handed it to her, and she drank it because her throat was dry and because accepting it was easier than refusing it. Tell me what you need, he said. I need to go home. I know that. What else? I can't think right now. I just know I have to go. Then stop thinking and listen. He sat on the edge of his desk, facing her, and his voice was quiet but firm. The voice of a man who was accustomed to solving problems and saw no reason why this one should be different. You'll take the bay gelding. He's faster than that borrowed mare, and he's sure-footed on bad roads. I'll send Walt to Ridgewater ahead of you tonight to get your mother's house ready. Firewood, water, supplies. Dr. Calloway will come again. I'll send word today. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. You have never once asked me for anything, Eliza. Not once. I'm the one who's telling you what's going to happen because right now you're too scared to think straight, and someone needs to think straight. It was the first time he had called her Eliza, not Miss Rowan. Eliza. Her name in his mouth sounded different than she expected, heavier, more careful, as though he'd been carrying it around for a while and had only just decided to set it down. She looked at him, he looked back, and in the lamplight of his study, surrounded by books and papers and the accumulated evidence of a wealthy man's busy, lonely life, something passed between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have made it real. And real was terrifying. My month is up, she said. Your month was up 3 weeks ago. I know, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to stay. I wanted you to stay. 3 words, simple as a fence post, heavy as the earth. Eliza pressed her hands together in her lap to keep them still. I don't know how long I'll be gone. Doesn't matter. It might be weeks. It might be... She stopped. It might be longer, I know. He stood up and walked to the window, putting his back to her, which she understood was not dismissal, but privacy. The privacy of a man who needed a moment to arrange his face before turning around again. Your room will be here when you get back. Your job will be here. If you need anything, money, supplies, a doctor, anything, you send word and I'll send it. Why are you doing this? He turned. Because you walked into my house a month and a half ago and you cleaned my kitchen, and you made bread at midnight, and you fixed my porch, and you trimmed my lamps, and you sat across from me and ate dinner, and you asked me questions nobody has asked me in 8 years. And because before you came, this house was just a building where I slept, and now it's—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Now it's something else." The room was very still. "I have to go," Eliza said. "I know. I'll come back." "You don't have to promise that." "I'm not promising. I'm telling you." She stood up. They were close, closer than they'd ever been, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and smell the leather and coffee and old paper that was the smell of his study and, by extension, the smell of him. She wanted to say something else, something that would capture the weight of what she felt, the strange, complicated, terrifying thing that was growing between them. But words were inadequate, and she knew it, and he knew it, and so she did the only thing that seemed honest. She reached out and squeezed his hand. Briefly. Just long enough for the contact to register, his skin rough, his fingers strong, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second before he let go. Then she walked out. She didn't sleep. She packed her things, the spare shirt, the letters, the sourdough starter in its jar, her mother's recipe on the seed catalog page, and then she went to the kitchen and cooked. She cooked for hours. She made bread, enough for 3 days. She made 2 pies and a stew that could be reheated. She wrote instructions for Harlan on a sheet of paper, detailed, patient, specific, covering everything from how to keep the starter alive to how long the bread needed to proof to the proper temperature for pie crust. She organized the pantry one more time, making sure everything was labeled, everything was sealed, everything was in its place. At 4 in the morning, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Silas's heavy tread, lighter steps, quicker. Walt appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for riding, his hat in his hand. "I'm heading out now," he said. "I'll have the house ready by the time you get there." "You don't have to ride through the night." "Too late. I'm already awake and the coffee's already in me. Besides, your mother's house has a leaking roof, and I'd rather fix it before she has to ask." Eliza stared at him. "How do you know about the roof?" "You mentioned it, weeks ago, when you were talking to Mr. Ashcroft about feeling guilty." "You heard that?" Walt shrugged. "Sound carries in old houses. Don't worry, I wasn't listening on purpose. But once I heard it, I figured somebody ought to remember it." He put his hat on. "I'll see you in Ridgewater, Miss Rowan. Ride safe." He left. She heard his horse in the yard, the quick beat of hooves on packed earth, and then he was gone, riding into the darkness ahead of her, and she stood in the kitchen. She had made her own and felt the loss of it already, before she had even left. The clean counters, the organized shelves, the stove she had scrubbed and seasoned and nursed back into proper working order, the table where she kneaded dough every morning, the window where Ed Garza left wildflowers in a tin can. She packed the last of the bread and the pies into a saddlebag. She wrote a note and left it on the counter. For the crew. Don't let Harlan overcook the beans. Then she went to the stable. The bay gelding was saddled and waiting. Someone had done it for her, though she didn't know who. Her borrowed mare from Mr. Hadley was unsaddled in the next stall, ready to be returned at leisure. Beside the gelding, hanging from a hook on the stall door, was a saddlebag she hadn't packed. She opened it and found dried beef, hardtack, 2 apples, a canteen of water, and an envelope. She opened the envelope. Inside was money, more money than she had ever held at one time. Bills folded neatly, enough to cover her mother's medicine and food and firewood for months. And a note, written in Silas's blunt, plain hand. "This is not charity. This is wages owed for 6 weeks of work that was worth more than I paid. Don't argue. Buy your mother something good to eat and fix that stove of yours." She stood in the stable with the note in one hand and the money in the other, and she let herself cry. Not for long, not more than a minute, but she let herself because the kindness of it was so unexpected and so specific and so entirely like him, practical and generous, and wrapped in gruffness to disguise the tenderness underneath, that holding it back would have been dishonest. She wiped her face. She pocketed the money. She tucked the note into the seed catalog page beside her mother's recipe, where it fit as though it had always belonged there. She led the gelding out of the stable into the gray pre-dawn light. The ranch was quiet. The bunkhouse windows were dark. The main house sat against the ridge like a fortress, the way it had the first time she'd seen it, except now it didn't look like a fortress at all. It looked like a house, a big, beautiful, sad house that had just started remembering how to be warm. She mounted the gelding. He was taller than the mare, steadier, and he moved with the calm assurance of a horse that had been well trained and well cared for, which was the one thing Silas Ashcroft had never neglected, whatever else he let fall apart. She turned in the saddle for one last look. Silas was standing on the porch. She hadn't heard him come out. He was in his shirt sleeves, no hat, his arms crossed over his chest, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read from this distance, but that she felt all the way across the yard. A look that was not goodbye, but something harder to name. Something that lived in the space between letting go and holding on. She raised her hand. He raised his. Then she turned the gelding toward the gate and rode out, heading east toward Ridgewater and her mother and the small battered house where she had grown up, carrying with her a saddlebag of food, an envelope of money, a jar of sourdough starter, and a recipe written on the back of a seed catalog page that had somehow, without her quite understanding how, become the thread connecting two lives that should never have intersected and now could not be easily untangled. The sun came up behind her as she rode. The prairie stretched out ahead, wide and golden and indifferent to the concerns of the people who crossed it. Somewhere behind her, a man she had known for 6 weeks was standing on a porch she had repaired, watching her disappear into a distance he could not follow. And somewhere ahead, a woman she had known her entire life was lying in a bed, waiting for her daughter to come home. Eliza rode between them. The gelding was fast, the road was dry, and she did not look back again, not because she didn't want to, but because looking back would have made it harder to keep going, and keeping going was the only thing she knew how to do. She found her mother thinner than she remembered. That was the first thing, not the house, not the repaired roof that Walt had already fixed by the time she arrived, not the firewood stacked neatly against the side wall or the fresh water in the barrel by the door. The first thing was Clara, propped up on pillows in the narrow bed in the back room, with her hair loose and her cheeks hollow and her eyes too bright, the way eyes get when the body behind them is burning through its reserves. "You look terrible," Clara said. "I rode 26 miles. You look like you rode 50. Clara's voice was thinner too, stripped down to its frame the way the rest of her was. But the sharpness was still there, the dry, undecorated honesty that Eliza had inherited along with her mother's cheekbones and her sourdough recipe. "Come here. Let me see you." Eliza crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and let her mother take her hands, and Clara held them and turned them over and studied the calluses on her palms. New calluses, different from the ones she'd had before. The calluses of a woman who had spent 6 weeks kneading dough and scrubbing floors and hammering nails into a porch that belonged to someone else. "You've been working hard," Clara said. "So have you. You look like you haven't eaten in a week." "Mrs. Hadley brings food." "Mrs. Hadley brings charity. There's a difference." Clara smiled, a thin, tired smile that broke Eliza's heart precisely because it was genuine. "You sound like your father. He could never accept help either." "I accept help fine. I just prefer to earn it." She didn't mention the money in her pocket or where it had come from. Not yet. Instead, she unpacked her things, put the sourdough starter on the kitchen shelf where it belonged, and started cooking. The house was small, laughably small after Iron Ridge. 2 rooms, a kitchen that doubled as a parlor, and a sleeping area in the back that was barely large enough for a bed and a chest. The stove worked, barely. Walt had done something to it, tightened a joint or replaced a gasket, because it drew better than it had in months. The roof no longer leaked, which was a minor wonder. And there was food in the pantry, real food, not just the dried beans and cornmeal that had been their staples for years, but flour and butter and eggs and a jar of honey and dried apples and a sack of potatoes and a ham wrapped in cloth that had clearly come from somewhere with more resources than Mrs. Hadley's kitchen garden. Eliza looked at all of it and knew exactly where it had come from, and she stood in her mother's kitchen with her hands on the counter and felt something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude and frustration and a complicated tenderness for a man who sent supplies ahead in secret because he couldn't stand the idea of her walking into an empty pantry. She made soup, simple because Clara's stomach couldn't handle much, chicken broth with noodles and a little bit of shredded meat and enough garlic to ward off anything that might be thinking about making Clara worse. She carried a bowl to the bedroom and sat beside her mother and watched her eat, spoonful by careful spoonful, And when Clara had finished half the bowl, she set it aside and looked at her daughter with an expression that was equal parts love and suspicion. "Who is he?" Clara said. "Who is who?" "The man who sent all that food, and the doctor, and whatever else he sent that you're not telling me about." Eliza considered lying. She considered it for about 3 seconds, which was approximately 2 seconds longer than any lie had ever survived in Clara Rowan's presence. "His name is Silas Ashcroft. He owns Iron Ridge Ranch. I work for him." "You work for the richest man in the territory." "I cook for him, and clean, and fix things." Clara studied her daughter the way she always did, with a directness that bypassed every defense Eliza had ever built and went straight to the truth underneath. "And," Clara said, "and nothing. He's my employer. Eliza. Mama. I've been sick. I haven't been stupid. A man doesn't send a doctor and a pantry full of food for someone who just cooks and cleans." Eliza looked down at her hands, the calluses, the flour under her nails that never quite came clean no matter how hard she scrubbed, the small scar on her index finger from the knife that slipped the second week at Iron Ridge, when she was cutting potatoes too fast because she was trying to prove something to no one in particular. "I don't know what he is," she said. "I know he's lonely. I know his wife died 8 years ago and he closed up a room in his house and set his dinner table for one and forgot how to talk to people. I know he's not an easy man. I know he fired more workers than I can count, and he speaks in sentences that barely qualify as sentences, and he has never in his life said a soft thing when a hard thing would do. But he sent a doctor to you, and he gave me his best horse, and he stood on his porch in his shirt sleeves at dawn and watched me ride away and didn't say goodbye because I think he didn't know how." Clara was quiet for a long time. The soup was cooling in its bowl. Outside, a bird was singing the same 3 notes over and over, the way birds do when they have something to say and no one to say it to. "Your father was like that," Clara said finally. "Couldn't say a tender thing to save his life. Used to show me he loved me by fixing things. I'd wake up in the morning and the fence would be mended or the gate would be rehung or there'd be firewood stacked by the door. Never said a word about it. Just did it and went about his day like it was nothing." It wasn't nothing. No, it wasn't nothing. Clara reached for her daughter's hand. "Be careful, Eliza." "I am careful." "No, you're not. You're brave. That's different. Brave gets you through the door. Careful keeps you from getting hurt on the other side." Eliza squeezed her mother's hand. "Get some rest. I'll be in the kitchen." "You're always in the kitchen." "That's because the kitchen is where things get fixed." Clara laughed, a small, wheezy laugh that turned into a cough, that turned into a long, ragged breath that made Eliza's chest tighten, and then she closed her eyes and slept, and Eliza sat beside her and listened to her breathe and counted each breath the way a miser counts coins, as though keeping track might prevent them from running out. The days in Ridgewater settled into a rhythm that was slower than Iron Ridge, but no less demanding. Eliza cooked and cleaned and tended her mother and managed the household on a fraction of the resources she'd had at the ranch. She baked bread, her mother's sourdough, always, and sold loaves to the neighbors and to the hotel in town, which had been buying bread from a bakery in Cedar Falls and was happy to switch to a local source that was cheaper and, frankly, better. She sold pies, too. Word got around fast in a town the size of Ridgewater, not because the town was gossipy, though it was, but because good pie is the kind of news that travels on its own legs. Within 2 weeks, she had standing orders from the hotel, the general store, and the owner of the one saloon, a weathered man named Casper Gibbs, who had never in his life been accused of sentiment, but who told Eliza with complete sincerity that her apple pie was the best thing he'd put in his mouth since 1861, and he'd pay whatever she wanted for a steady supply. $1 a pie, Eliza said. 75 cents. $1. The crust alone is worth that. Casper squinted at her. You drive a hard bargain for someone who's been baking out of a house the size of my coat closet. The size of the kitchen doesn't change the quality of the pie, Mr. Gibbs. He paid the $1. Clara improved. Slowly, grudgingly, the way a stubborn woman improves when her equally stubborn daughter refuses to let her do otherwise. Dr. Calloway came twice more, paid for by bank drafts from Iron Ridge that arrived like clockwork, without explanation or fanfare, and each time her assessment was cautiously better. The coughing had eased. The color was returning to Clara's face. She was eating more, sleeping better, and had begun, over Eliza's strenuous objections, getting out of bed to sit in the kitchen while Eliza baked, offering commentary and criticism with the authority of a woman who had been making bread since before her daughter was born. "You're overworking the dough," Clara said one morning, watching from her chair. "I am not overworking the dough." "You are. You're angry about something and you're taking it out on that bread." Eliza stopped kneading. She looked at the dough. It was, in fact, slightly overworked, tighter than it should have been, resistant under her hands, the way dough gets when you push it past cooperation into stubbornness. "I'm not angry," she said. "Then what are you?" Eliza didn't answer. She folded the dough, gave it a gentle turn, and covered it with a cloth to rest. Then she washed her hands and sat down across from her mother and said the thing she had been carrying around for 2 weeks, the thing that sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and sharp and impossible to ignore. "I miss it. The ranch, The ranch, the kitchen, the crew, Walt, Billy, even Harlan." She paused. "Him." Clara nodded. She didn't say "I told you so" or "be careful again" or any of the things a mother might say when her daughter admits to missing a man who is too old and too rich and too broken for any of it to make sense. She just nodded, the way she did when she was thinking, and reached across the table and covered Eliza's hand with her own. "Then go back," Clara said. "I can't leave you." "You can. I'm better. Dr. Calloway said so. Mrs. Hadley comes twice a week. And I've been taking care of myself since before you were born, Eliza Rowan, so don't sit there acting like I'll fall apart the moment you walk out that door." "You did fall apart. That's why I'm here." The sharpness of it surprised both of them. Eliza heard the words come out and wished she could grab them back, but it was too late. They were out, hanging in the air between mother and daughter, true and unkind in equal measure. Clara flinched, just barely. Then she straightened in her chair and met her daughter's eyes with the same unflinching honesty she had passed down like an heirloom. "You're right," she said. "I did. And you came home and you took care of me, and I am grateful for every minute of it. But I'm not going to be the reason you miss your life, Eliza. I am not going to be the sick mother who holds her daughter back. I refuse." "That's not—" "It is. It's exactly what's happening. You're here out of love, and I'm letting you stay out of selfishness. And neither one of those things is good enough reason for you to stop living." The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the shelf. The same clock that had been ticking in this kitchen for as long as Eliza could remember, measuring out the hours of a small life in a small house in a small town, and for the first time she heard it not as a comfort, but as a countdown. "I started a bakery," Eliza said. "I know, I've been watching. If I go back to Iron Ridge, I lose the bakery. Or you bring the bakery with you, or you build a new one, or you figure out something I haven't thought of because I'm old and tired and you're young and smarter than me." "I'm not smarter than you." "You are. You just don't know it yet because mothers are supposed to be the smart ones, and admitting your daughter has outgrown you is one of the hardest things a woman can do." Clara's eyes were bright, not with fever this time, but with something else, something fierce and proud and bittersweet. "Go back, Eliza. Go back and do whatever it is you're supposed to do. I'll be here when you need me." Eliza didn't go back. Not right away. She spent another week in Ridgewater, banking bread orders, teaching Mrs. Hadley how to maintain the sourdough starter, and making sure her mother's house was stocked and clean and solid enough to stand without her. She fixed the hinge on the front door. She patched a crack in the kitchen wall. She split enough firewood for a month and stacked it where Clara could reach it without bending. And she baked. She baked more than she ever had. Bread and pies and biscuits and a cake for Mrs. Hadley's birthday that used up all the sugar and most of the eggs, and was, if she was being honest, probably the best thing she'd ever made. She baked the way some people drink, compulsively, excessively, as a way of processing feelings she wasn't ready to name. The kitchen counter disappeared under cooling racks and flour dust, and the warm, yeasty smell that was the smell of her childhood and her mother and her own deepest sense of who she was. She didn't write to Silas. She wanted to, sat down twice with a pen and paper and started letters that went nowhere. Letters that began, "Dear Mr. Ashcroft," and stalled out because everything she wanted to say was either too much or not enough. "How do you thank a man for saving your mother's life without making it sound like you owe him? How do you tell a man you miss his kitchen without admitting you miss him? How do you explain that the best 6 weeks of your life happened in someone else's house, cooking someone else's meals, trimming someone else's lamps, and that leaving felt like tearing a page out of a book that wasn't finished yet. She couldn't write any of that, so she didn't write at all. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, with the heat pressing down on Ridgewater like a hand, and the air thick with the smell of baking bread and dry grass, Eliza walked out of her mother's house to check the oven she'd set up in the yard. A crude thing, built from bricks and scrap metal, but functional, and saw a horse coming up the road. Not just any horse. A big gray stallion with a chest like a barrel and legs like posts, the kind of horse that cost more than most people's houses and moved with the absolute confidence of an animal that knew exactly how much it was worth. And on the horse, sitting straight-backed and square-shouldered and wearing a clean shirt that he had obviously put on that morning for the first time in weeks because the collar was still stiff, was Silas Ashcroft. He rode up to the house and stopped. He sat there for a moment, looking down at Eliza, and she stood there with flour on her face and a bread paddle in her hand and her heart doing something it had never done before, which was absolutely nothing useful, just slamming against her ribs like a bird in a cage. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. "Miss Rowan." He dismounted. He was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in cloth, tucked under one arm with the awkward care of a man who was not accustomed to carrying things that mattered. "What is that?" Eliza asked. "Pie." She stared at him. "You brought pie." "I made pie." He held out the bundle, and she took it, and even through the cloth she could feel that it was still warm and that the crust was uneven, lumpy on one side, thin on the other, the work of hands that were accustomed to holding reins and signing contracts and doing absolutely everything except baking. "You made a pie," she repeated. "I used your recipe. The one you left for Harlan. I followed the instructions exactly." "Did you?" "I might have overworked the crust." "You might have." Harlan said it looked like a saddle that lost a fight. A pause. He wasn't wrong. Eliza looked down at the pie in her hands, ugly, lopsided. The crust cracked in places where it had been pressed too hard. The edges crimped unevenly. A small burn mark on one side where it had sat too close to the heat. It was without question the worst-looking pie she had ever seen. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She wanted to set the pie down on the ground and walk over to Silas Ashcroft and put her arms around him and tell him that a rich man riding 26 miles to deliver a bad pie to a poor woman's kitchen was the most absurd and the most honest thing anyone had ever done for her. Instead, she said, "Come inside, I'll put the coffee on." He followed her into the kitchen, her mother's kitchen, small and cramped and nothing like the vast, gleaming space at Iron Ridge. And he stood in the middle of it looking like a man who had suddenly realized that he was too tall for the ceiling and too broad for the doorway and too everything for a room this size. And yet, he didn't move to leave. He just stood there, turning his hat in his hands, and looked at Eliza, and she looked at him. And the kitchen was so small that they were barely 3 feet apart. "How's your mother?" he asked. "Better. She's sleeping." "Good. That's good." "How's the ranch?" "Standing. Harlan's cooking has improved. He can make gravy now without lumps." "I taught him that." "I know." He mentioned it several times with great reluctance. Eliza set the coffee to boil. She put the pie on the table. She turned back to Silas and crossed her arms over her chest because she needed something to do with her hands, and crossing her arms was the only thing that didn't involve reaching for him. "Why are you here, Mr. Ashcroft?" He stopped turning his hat. He looked at her, not with the cold, flat gaze she had first met at his front door, and not with the cautious, careful attention of their dinners together. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time, and has finally decided to stop thinking about and start saying, "Because the house is empty," he said. "Because I eat dinner alone and the food tastes like nothing regardless of what Harlan does to it. Because I sit in my study and the lamp is trimmed and the books are there and the whiskey is there and none of it means anything because the chair across from my desk is empty and it turns out I got used to it not being empty and I can't get unused to it." "Silas, I'm not finished." He took a breath. The hat was still in his hands and his knuckles were white. "I am not a young man. I am not a kind man. I am not the man your mother would choose for you, and I am probably not the man you'd choose for yourself if you had every man on the frontier lined up in front of you. I have more money than I know what to do with, and less sense than I ought to, and I have spent 8 years building walls that you walked through in about a week and a half. And I don't know what that means, But I know that I rode 26 miles with a bad pie to tell you that my house is not a house without you in it, and I don't want another empty mansion if you're not there." The coffee was boiling, the kitchen was full of steam and the smell of bread from the outdoor oven, and the afternoon sun was coming through the window and landing on the table, on the lopsided pie, on Silas's hands gripping his hat, on Eliza's hands pressed against her own arms. "That pie really is terrible," she said. "I know." "The crust is all wrong." "I know." "You used too much water, that's why it cracked." "I'll do better next time." "You're assuming there's going to be a next time." "I'm hoping." She uncrossed her arms. She took a step toward him, then another. The kitchen was so small that 2 steps brought her close enough to see the dust on his collar and the sweat on his temple and the way his jaw was clenched tight, the way it always clenched when he was feeling something he didn't want to feel, which was most of the time. "I'm not going back to being your employee," she said. "I'm not asking you to." "What are you asking?" He looked at her, looked right at her, all of her, the flour on her face and the calluses on her hands, and the 19 years of hard work and harder choices written in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze, and he said very quietly, "I'm asking if there's room." "Room for what?" "For me. In whatever this is. In whatever you're building here. In your life. I'm asking if there's room for a man who finally figured out that the biggest ranch in the territory isn't worth a damn if the only person in it is himself." The coffee boiled over. Neither of them moved to take it off the stove. The steam rose and the kitchen filled with the smell of scorched coffee and fresh bread, and the late summer heat pressed in through the open window. And somewhere in the back room, Clara Rowan was sleeping, and somewhere 26 miles west, a ranch full of men were probably placing bets on whether their boss had made a fool of himself yet. And in the middle of all of it, in a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand without touching, Eliza Rowan reached out and took the hat from Silas Ashcroft's hands and set it on the table next to the ugly pie. "There's room," she said. He exhaled. She could hear it, a long, slow breath, the sound of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for years. His shoulders dropped. The tension in his jaw released, and he reached out, carefully, the way you reach for something you're afraid might disappear, and took her hand. They stood there. The coffee burned on the stove. The bread needed to come out of the outdoor oven. The pie sat on the table looking ridiculous and lopsided and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. And for a long moment, in a tiny kitchen, in a tiny house, in a town that nobody important had ever heard of, the richest man in the territory and the woman who had changed his life held hands and said nothing, because some things are too large for words and too true for anything except silence. The coffee stain never came out of the stovetop. Eliza tried 3 times in the days that followed. Lye soap, baking soda, vinegar, but the ring of scorched coffee remained, a dark circle on the iron surface like a brand, and eventually she stopped trying to remove it and started thinking of it as a marker. The place where everything changed, the spot on the map where the old road ended and the new one began, even though she hadn't known she was looking for a new road, and wouldn't have recognized it if Silas Ashcroft hadn't ridden 26 miles on a gray stallion with a terrible pie to show her where it was. He stayed in Ridgewater for 3 days, not in her mother's house. Even a man as unconventional as Silas Ashcroft understood that there were limits to what a small town would tolerate, and a wealthy rancher sleeping under the same roof as a 19-year-old woman he wasn't married to was well beyond those limits. He took a room at the hotel, the nicest one they had, which was still barely half the size of the spare room Eliza had slept in at Iron Ridge, and had a mattress that sagged in the middle like a tired horse. He didn't complain about it. He didn't complain about anything, which was so unlike the Silas Ashcroft that Eliza had come to know, the man who complained about everything from the weather to the price of feed to the way his own coffee tasted, that she found it both touching and slightly alarming. "You're being polite," she told him on the second morning, when he came to the house for breakfast and sat at Clara's kitchen table with his knees pressed against the underside because the table was too low and his legs were too long. "It's making me nervous." "I'm not being polite. I'm being strategic. Your mother is in the next room, and she has opinions about me that I haven't had a chance to change yet." "My mother's opinions are not easily changed. Neither are mine. That's something we have in common." Clara, as it turned out, had plenty of opinions about Silas Ashcroft, and she delivered them with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire life saying exactly what she meant, and saw no reason to stop now, just because the richest man in the territory was sitting at her kitchen table eating eggs her daughter had cooked. "You're too old for her," Clara said on the first evening, when Silas had come for dinner and the three of them were sitting around the table in the kitchen that barely fit 3 people in their 3 plates, and the bread basket and the butter dish and Silas's elbows. "Mama!" "I'm talking to him." Clara's eyes were fixed on Silas with the steady, unblinking gaze of a woman who had survived poverty and widowhood and a lung ailment that had nearly killed her, and who was not about to be intimidated by a man's bank account. "You're too old. You're too rich. You live too far away. And you have a reputation for being difficult." Silas set down his fork. He met Clara's gaze without flinching, which was impressive because Clara's gaze could have peeled paint off a barn door. "All of that is true," he said. "Then what exactly are your intentions?" "Mama, we're not—" "Eliza, please, I asked the man a question." Silas looked at Clara, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but settled, the way a foundation settles when it finds solid ground. "Mrs. Rowan, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm something I'm not. I'm 52 years old. My wife has been dead for 8 years. I've spent those 8 years turning into the kind of man that nobody particularly wants to be around, including myself. Your daughter walked into my house and changed that, and I don't fully understand how she did it, and I suspect I never will." "That's not an answer to my question. My intention is to be wherever she is, whether that's here or at Iron Ridge or in the middle of the road. I'm not going to ask her to give up anything. I'm not going to buy her with my money or my ranch or anything else. I'm going to be here, and if she'll have me, I'll stay. And if she won't, I'll ride home and spend the rest of my life eating bad pie and regretting it." Clara stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Eliza. Then she picked up her fork and went back to eating. "The chicken is dry," she said. "It is not dry," Eliza said. "It's a little dry," Silas said. Eliza looked at both of them. Her mother, who was impossible, and this man, who was also impossible, sitting at a table that was too small in a kitchen that was too cramped, eating chicken that was not dry. And she felt a laugh building in her chest that she couldn't quite suppress, and she let it out, and it sounded strange in that room because she hadn't really laughed in weeks, and it felt like opening a window that had been painted shut. The 3 days passed. Silas helped with the house, not because it needed much, since Walt had already done the major repairs, but because he was a man who couldn't sit still, and because helping was the only language he knew for the things he couldn't say. He rehung the front door that Eliza had already fixed, and she let him, because his version was better, straighter, tighter, the work of a man who had built a ranch from nothing and knew what a proper hinge looked like. He reinforced the chicken coop. He split firewood with the focused intensity of someone who was working through a problem in his head, and Eliza watched him from the kitchen window and wondered what the problem was, and whether she was part of it, and whether being part of someone's problem was the same thing as being part of their life. On the 3rd morning, over coffee that Eliza had made strong the way he liked it, the way he had never told her he liked it, but she knew because she paid attention, Silas said, "I have to go back." "I know. The ranch doesn't run itself. Walt's capable, but there are decisions that need making, and if I leave Harlan in charge of the kitchen much longer, the men might mutiny." Eliza smiled. "His gravy really has improved. His gravy is adequate. There's a difference between improved and good, and Harlan lives firmly in the territory of improved." She poured more coffee. The kitchen was warm with morning light, and Clara was still sleeping in the back room. She slept later now, which Dr. Calloway said was a sign of healing, the body demanding the rest it had been denied for years. "Come with me," Silas said. "I can't. Not yet. She's better, but she's not well. I need more time." "How much time?" "I don't know. A few weeks? Maybe a month?" He nodded. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and she noticed, not for the first time, how large his hands were, how rough, how utterly unsuited to holding anything as delicate as a cup or a feeling, and yet here he was, holding both. "I'll wait," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference between those things too, Eliza, and I spent about 40 years not knowing it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His fingers curled around hers, slowly, carefully, like a man picking up something breakable. "I'll come back," she said. "I already told you that." "I know you did. I'm just reminding myself." He left that afternoon. She watched him ride out from the yard, the gray stallion moving with its usual lordly confidence, and Silas sitting straight in the saddle the way he always sat, like a man who owned everything he could see, which he mostly did, though the thing he wanted most was standing behind him in a flour-dusted apron, watching him go. The weeks that followed were the longest of Eliza's life, and also, in a way she hadn't expected, the most productive. She threw herself into the bakery. What had started as a way to earn grocery money, a few loaves of bread, a handful of pies, had grown, almost without her noticing, into something larger. Casper Gibbs at the saloon wanted pies every week. The hotel wanted bread daily. Mrs. Patterson at the general store asked if Eliza could make cinnamon rolls because her daughter's birthday was coming, and the girl had been talking about cinnamon rolls since Christmas. A rancher named Tom Shelby rode 12 miles from his spread to buy 6 loaves after his wife mentioned the bread at a church social. He paid in cash and ordered more for the following week, and the week after that his neighbor came, and then his neighbor's neighbor. Eliza's outdoor brick oven, the crude contraption she'd built from scraps, couldn't keep up. She baked from before dawn until mid-morning, and by noon everything was sold, and by evening she was mixing dough for the next day, and her arms ached and her back hurt, and her hands were perpetually crusted with flour that worked itself into every crack and callus. She loved it. She loved it in a way she hadn't expected. Not just the baking, which she had always loved, but the business of it. The daily puzzle of supply and demand, the satisfaction of turning flour and water and salt into money that she could hold in her hand and know she'd earned. It was different from working at Iron Ridge, where she had been brilliant and necessary, but ultimately employed, doing someone else's work in someone else's kitchen. This was hers. Every loaf, every pie, every cinnamon roll was a thing she had made and sold and been paid for, and the independence of it was intoxicating. Clara saw it happening and said nothing, which was Clara's way of approving. She saved her words for disapproval and let silence stand as endorsement. But one evening, sitting in the kitchen while Eliza kneaded dough for the morning's bread, she said, "You need a real oven." "I need a lot of things." "You need a real oven, and you need a proper space, and you need to stop pretending this is temporary." Eliza looked at her mother. Clara's color was better, really better, not the polite fiction of better that people offer when they don't want to worry you. Her cheeks had filled out. Her breathing was easier. She was eating regular meals and taking short walks in the yard, and had even, 2 days ago, made a pot of soup on her own, which Eliza had pretended not to notice because acknowledging it would have prompted a lecture about overprotectiveness. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you have a gift, and gifts are not meant to be exercised out of a brick pile in the yard. I'm saying you should build a bakery." "With what money?" "With the money you've been saving, and the money that man sent, and whatever else you can scrape together. You're resourceful, Eliza. You always have been. Stop waiting for permission and build the thing." It was so like Clara, so direct, so unsentimental, so absolutely right that Eliza couldn't argue with it. She tried, out of habit, because arguing with her mother was as natural as breathing and approximately as frequent, but the argument sounded hollow even to her own ears, and by the end of the conversation she had stopped arguing and started planning. She found a space. It wasn't much. An empty storefront on the main street of Ridgewater between the general store and the land office, with a front room big enough for a counter and a few tables, and a back room big enough for ovens and workspace. The rent was $8 a month, which was more than she could comfortably afford, but less than she'd feared. And the landlord, a retired cattleman named Josiah Burke, who owned half the buildings in town and had a soft spot for young people with more ambition than sense, agreed to let her have the first month free in exchange for a standing pie order. She cleaned the space herself, scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, whitewashed the walls. She built shelves from scrap lumber, the way she'd built the outdoor oven, rough but functional, strong enough to hold what they needed to hold. She bought a proper stove from the catalog, the biggest one she could afford, and waited 3 agonizing weeks for it to arrive by freight wagon from St. Louis. She didn't ask Silas for money. She thought about it. Thought about how easy it would be, how a single letter could bring enough cash to outfit the entire bakery in copper and brass. But something stopped her. Not pride exactly, something more complicated than pride. The knowledge that whatever she built needed to be built on her own terms with her own hands, or it wouldn't feel like hers. Silas's money had saved her mother's life, and she would never forget that, But the bakery was a different thing. The bakery was her foundation, and foundations had to be solid all the way down or they cracked under weight. She wrote to him instead. Short letters, practical, reporting on her mother's health and the progress of the bakery, the way she might have reported on the state of the Iron Ridge kitchen, inventory, status, plans. She didn't write about feelings, neither did he. His letters back were brief and blunt, and exactly what she expected. The ranch was fine, the cattle were healthy, Harlan had attempted a pie and the result was not poisonous, which is improvement. Walt sent his regards. Billy Cortez had broken his arm falling off a horse, which was both unfortunate and statistically inevitable. Ed Garza still left wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, even though there was no one there to see them, which was either touching or insane depending on your perspective. Each letter ended the same way. The doors open when you're ready. The bakery opened on a Saturday in October. Eliza had painted the sign herself, Rowan's Bakery, in simple black letters on a white board. It wasn't fancy. The lettering was slightly uneven, the R leaning a bit to the left, and she dripped paint on the boardwalk and had to scrub it off before the landlord saw. But it was hers, and it was real. And when she turned the sign to open at 6 in the morning and the bell over the door chimed for the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Not happiness exactly, but arrival. The sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. Clara came for the opening. She sat in the corner at the small table Eliza had set up for customers who wanted to eat in, and she drank coffee and ate a cinnamon roll and watched her daughter work with an expression that Eliza recognized from a lifetime of observation. The expression of a woman who was trying very hard not to cry and was succeeding only through force of will. "Don't," Eliza said, passing behind her with a tray of bread. "I'm not." "You are. Your eyes are doing that thing." "My eyes are doing nothing. I have something in them." "You have pride in them. It's obvious." "Well," Clara said, lifting her chin, "maybe I do. Is that a crime?" The bakery did well. Not spectacularly. There were slow days and days when the bread didn't turn out right because the weather was too cold or too humid, or because Eliza had been distracted, and days when she counted the cash in the register and wondered if she was going to make rent. But it did well enough. People came. They came for the bread and the pies and the cinnamon rolls. And they came because Ridgewater had never had a proper bakery before. And they came because Eliza Rowan stood behind the counter with flour on her apron and warmth in her voice and made everyone who walked through the door feel like they'd been invited into someone's kitchen, which they had. Silas came on a Tuesday. No fanfare. No announcement. Just the bell over the door chiming at 10 in the morning, and there he was, standing in her bakery in a clean shirt and boots that had been polished recently, probably that morning, probably by hand, probably for the first time in months, looking around the small room with an expression she knew well by now. The expression of a man taking inventory, counting the shelves, measuring the space, calculating whether the stove was big enough, whether the counter was strong enough, whether the whole operation made financial sense. "It's small," he said. "It's mine." I didn't say that was a bad thing. He walked to the counter, looked at the bread cooling on the rack, the pies lined up by the window, the chalkboard on the wall where she'd written the day's offerings in her careful hand. "You need a bigger oven." "I know." "And more counter space." "I know that too." "And someone to help. You can't run this alone." "I've been running it alone for 3 weeks." "And you look like you haven't slept in 2 of them." She opened her mouth to argue, but he was right. She was tired. Not the desperate, frightened exhaustion of those first weeks at Iron Ridge, when she'd been working to prove herself. This was a different kind of tired, the bone-deep weariness of a person who was doing too much because the work mattered to her, and she didn't know how to do less. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you coffee." "I don't want coffee. I want to talk to you." "We can talk over coffee." "Eliza." She stopped. He was standing on the other side of the counter, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the coldness of their first meeting, not the cautious warmth of their dinners at Iron Ridge, not the raw vulnerability of his speech in her mother's kitchen. This was something else, something settled and certain. The expression of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in being talked out of it. "I'm not going back to Iron Ridge," he said. She stared at him. "What?" "I'm leaving the ranch to Walt. Not permanently. I still own it, and I'll still manage the business side. But the day-to-day, the cattle, The crew? Walt can handle it. He's been handling it since you left, and he's better at it than I am, which is something I should have admitted 5 years ago but didn't, because I'm stubborn and proud, and it took a 19-year-old girl with a sourdough starter to make me realize that running the biggest ranch in the territory is not actually the most important thing I could be doing with my life. Silas, you can't just... I already did. I told Walt yesterday. He said, and I'm quoting, "about damn time." Harlan said roughly the same thing, except with more profanity. Billy Cortez cried, but Billy Cortez cries when the wind changes direction, so I'm not reading too much into that. Eliza leaned against the counter. Her head was spinning, not unpleasantly, but with the disorientation of someone who has been walking in one direction for a long time and has suddenly been turned around. What are you going to do? That depends on you. On me. On whether there's room in this bakery for a man who can't bake, doesn't know how to make change, and has no experience whatsoever in the retail food business. You want to work in my bakery. I want to be where you are. The bakery is where you are, so yes. You're the richest man in the territory. You can't work in a bakery. Why not? Because... She stopped. Because why? Because it was absurd? Because people would talk? Because a man like Silas Ashcroft, with his 12,000 head of cattle and his mansion on the ridge, didn't belong behind a counter in a small-town bakery selling bread and pies to farmers and their wives? Except he was standing here, in her bakery, in a clean shirt, asking. You'd have to learn to bake, she said. I made a pie. That pie was a war crime, Silas. The corner of his mouth twitched. There it was. That almost smile she'd been tracking since the first week at Iron Ridge. The one that never quite made it to full expression, but was getting closer every time. I'll learn, he said. I learned to run cattle. I learned to build a ranch. I learned to survive a winter that killed half my herd and broke my heart. I can learn to make a pie that doesn't look like it lost a fight. Eliza looked at him across the counter of her bakery, the thing she had built with her own hands from nothing, and she saw not the cattle baron, not the richest man in the territory, not the cold, hard, lonely man she had met at a door 3 months ago. She saw a man who was standing in a room that was too small for him, offering to make himself smaller, because the alternative was going back to a house that was too big and too empty and too quiet. I can't pay you, she said. I don't need money. Everybody needs money. I have money. What I need is... He stopped, swallowed, started again. What I need is something I can't buy. I've spent 52 years figuring that out, which makes me either a slow learner or an optimist, and I have never been accused of optimism. She came around the counter. She stood in front of him, close enough to see the dust on his collar and the lines around his eyes, and the small scar on his cheekbone that she had noticed the first time she'd looked at him closely, in the lamplight of his study, across a desk covered in papers. You can wash dishes, she said. I can wash dishes, and carry flour, and sweep floors, and deal with customers, which means being pleasant, which is not your natural state. I can be pleasant. You have never been pleasant in your life. Then I'll learn that too. She wanted to say something important, something that captured the weight of this moment, the way the whole trajectory of 2 lives had bent toward this small room in a small town on the frontier. But important things have a way of sounding ridiculous when you try to say them out loud, so instead she said, The flour is in the back. 50-pound sacks. Start there. He nodded. He took off his hat, hung it on a peg by the door, the same peg where she hung her apron every evening, and walked into the back room. And she heard him lifting a sack of flour with a grunt that suggested the richest man in the territory was not, perhaps, in the best physical condition for manual labor. And she smiled and went back to the counter and started rolling pie crust. The town of Ridgewater talked. Of course it talked. A town that's small runs on talk the way an engine runs on fuel, and Silas Ashcroft moving to Ridgewater to work in Eliza Rowan's bakery was the most compelling piece of fuel anyone had produced in years. Opinions ranged from scandalized to amused to cautiously approving, depending on who you asked and how long they'd been thinking about it. Casper Gibbs at the saloon summed up the general consensus with his usual economy of language. Rich man, poor woman, small town, big talk. Seen it before? Usually ends bad. He paused. But the pie's still good, so I'm reserving judgment. Mrs. Hadley, who had been checking on Clara since the illness started and who had earned the right to an opinion through accumulated kindness, told Eliza simply, "He looks at you like you're the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. That's either love or indigestion, and I'm betting on love." Clara said nothing, which was, as always, her highest form of approval. Silas was, as predicted, terrible at bakery work. He burned the first 3 batches of bread he attempted. He overfilled the pie tins. He measured flour with the casual imprecision of a man who had spent his life dealing in cattle and acreage, where a few pounds one way or the other didn't matter, and had to be retrained in the exacting art of baking, where a tablespoon too much of anything could ruin everything. He was also, unexpectedly, very good with customers. Not pleasant, that was still beyond his range, but direct in a way that people found refreshing after years of shopkeepers who smiled too much and said too little. When Tom Shelby's wife asked which bread was best, Silas told her the sourdough was the best bread in the territory, and if she disagreed, she was wrong. And Mrs. Shelby laughed so hard she bought 4 loaves instead of 2. When old Josiah Burke complained that the cinnamon rolls were smaller than last week, Silas told him the cinnamon rolls were exactly the same size, and the problem was Burke's memory, not Eliza's baking, and Burke laughed even harder and increased his standing order. "You're insulting my customers," Eliza told him one evening, after closing, while they cleaned the kitchen together. "They seem to like it." "That's not the point." "What is the point?" "The point is that customer service requires—" She stopped, because Silas was looking at her with that almost smile again, and she realized he was doing it on purpose, provoking her, drawing her out, making her laugh even when she was trying to be serious. It was a new skill for him, playfulness, and he wore it awkwardly, like a suit that didn't quite fit. But he was trying, and the trying mattered more than the fit. "You're impossible," she said. "So I've been told, repeatedly, by experts." They worked, side by side, day after day, in a kitchen that was too small for 2 people but somehow held them both. Silas learned to bake, slowly, grudgingly, with many failures and occasional triumphs, and one memorable afternoon when he produced a loaf of sourdough that was, by Eliza's professional assessment, not embarrassing, which was the highest praise she had ever given him, and which he accepted with an expression of such naked pride that she had to look away to keep from laughing. He learned the starter, too, the sourdough culture that Eliza had carried in a jar from her mother's kitchen to Iron Ridge, and back again. The living thing that connected Clara's recipes to Eliza's bread to the loaves that now filled the shelves of a real bakery in a real town. He fed it every evening, the way Eliza had taught him, measuring the flour and water with the meticulous precision of a convert who had discovered that baking was not so different from ranching. Both required patience and timing, and the willingness to work with something alive that had its own ideas about how things should go. The bakery grew, not fast and not without setbacks. There was a week in November when the stove broke and they lost 3 days of business while Silas took it apart and reassembled it with the dogged determination of a man who had once rebuilt an entire barn after a windstorm. There was a month when the flour supplier raised prices and Eliza had to recalculate every recipe and every price and every projection, sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a pencil and a ledger and a cup of cold coffee. There were arguments, real arguments, sharp and loud, the kind that happen when 2 stubborn people share a small space and both believe they're right, about pricing, about hours, about whether the cinnamon rolls should have icing, Eliza yes, Silas no, compromise a light glaze that satisfied neither of them completely, which is how most compromises work. But it grew. Word spread beyond Ridgewater, to Cedar Falls, to the ranches along the Blackwater River, to settlements and way stations, and even, eventually, to travelers on the new rail line that Silas had once talked about in his study at Iron Ridge. People came. Not because of his money or his name, most of them didn't know who he was, and those who did found it difficult to reconcile the feared cattle baron of Iron Ridge with the tall, gray-haired man in a flour-dusted apron who stood behind the counter and told them their bread opinions were wrong. They came because the bread was good, and the pies were better, and the little bakery on the main street of Ridgewater had something that no amount of money could manufacture. Warmth. That warmth came from Eliza, who had always had it, the quiet, steady kindness that made people feel welcome, that turned a room full of strangers into something closer to a kitchen full of family. But it also came, increasingly and surprisingly, from Silas. The man who had eaten dinner alone for 8 years, who had fired workers for small mistakes, who had spoken in sentences that rarely exceeded 5 words, was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with frequent relapses into gruffness, how to be around people, how to listen without judging, how to offer help without making it feel like charity, how to sit at a table with strangers and share a meal and let the conversation flow around him without trying to control it. He wasn't good at it. He would never be good at it, not in the natural, effortless way that Eliza was good at it. But he was present, and he was trying, and the trying was visible, and people responded to it the way they always respond to honesty, which is with a kind of grateful recognition, the feeling of watching someone do something hard and knowing it cost them something. Clara moved in above the bakery. Not because she couldn't live alone. Dr. Calloway had cleared her, reluctantly, with a long list of restrictions that Clara immediately and systematically ignored. But because Eliza had built a small apartment on the 2nd floor, 2 rooms and a kitchen, with a window that looked out over the main street, and because Clara wanted to be close to her daughter and would never in a million years admit it, so she framed it as practical and economical and better for my lungs, all of which were true and none of which were the real reason. The real reason sat in Clara's kitchen every morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, his long legs stretched out under the table, his voice rumbling through the floor like distant thunder. Clara had made peace with Silas, not enthusiastically, and not without continued commentary about the age difference and the unseemliness and the fact that he still couldn't bake a proper biscuit, but with the reluctant acceptance of a woman who recognized that her daughter had made a choice and that the choice, for all its imperfections, was making her happy. "He's growing on me," Clara admitted one evening when Silas was downstairs closing the bakery and Eliza was upstairs making dinner. "Like a fungus." "That's not a compliment." "It's not an insult either. Fungus is useful. It breaks things down. He's breaking down some things in himself that needed breaking." "You could just say you like him." "I could, but where's the fun in that?" They married in the spring. It was a small wedding, small enough to fit in the bakery, which is where they held it, because Eliza had refused the offer of Iron Ridge Ranch and its grand dining room and its stone and timber grandeur. "I don't want grand," she told Silas. "I want real." And the bakery was real. The scuffed floors, the flour-dusted shelves, the stove with the coffee stain that still wouldn't come off. The counter where she had rolled 10,000 pie crusts and where she would roll 10,000 more. Walt came down from Iron Ridge with half the crew. Billy Cortez cried, as predicted. Ed Garza brought wildflowers, a whole armload of them, prairie sage and yellow grass and purple coneflower, the same wildflowers he'd been leaving on the kitchen windowsill at Iron Ridge in a tin can. And he arranged them in jars on every table without being asked and without saying a word, which was Ed's way. Harlan Potts brought a pie. It was, by objective assessment, not terrible. Eliza ate a piece and told him the crust had improved, and Harlan nodded once and walked away. And that was the most emotional exchange they would ever have. And it was exactly enough. Clara sat in the front row. She was wearing her best dress, her only dress that wasn't patched, and she had done her hair, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had survived everything the frontier had thrown at her, and was now watching her daughter step into a life she had never imagined possible. She didn't cry. Rowan women didn't cry. But her eyes did that thing again, the thing Eliza had called her out on at the bakery opening. The bright, fierce, brimming thing that wasn't tears, wasn't quite pride, was something larger than both. After the wedding, after the guests had eaten the 3-tier cake that Eliza had baked herself and the bread that Silas had made, his best batch ever, golden and cracked across the top and not embarrassing at all, and after everyone had gone home and Clara had gone upstairs and the bakery was quiet, Eliza and Silas sat at one of the small tables by the window and looked out at the empty main street of Ridgewater. "I opened a parlor," Silas said. "What?" "At Iron Ridge. Before I came down here. I opened the parlor, the one you never asked about. The one I kept closed." Eliza was quiet. She had never asked about the closed parlor, not once, because she had understood from the first day that some rooms stay closed for a reason. "Margaret's things were in there," Silas said. His voice was steady, but his hands were wrapped around his coffee cup with the tightness of a man holding himself together. Her piano, her books, a quilt she was making when she got sick. I closed the door after she died, and I never opened it again because I thought that keeping it closed was the same thing as keeping her. Like if I didn't touch anything, she'd still be there somehow. In the dust. In the air. Silas. I opened it. I aired it out. I covered the piano, and I folded the quilt, and I took her books to the shelf in the study where they should have been all along. And then I sat in that room, and He stopped. He looked down at his coffee. I sat there for a long time. And I understood something I should have understood 8 years ago, which is that keeping a door closed doesn't keep anything. It just keeps you from moving through it. Eliza reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough, flour-dusted, scarred from 50 years of fence posts and branding irons, and, more recently, oven burns. She held his hand and didn't say anything, because some things don't need words. They need presence. They need a hand in yours in a quiet room, and the knowledge that the person sitting across from you understands your grief without trying to fix it, because grief is not a thing that gets fixed. It's a thing that gets carried, and the carrying gets easier when someone helps you hold the weight. They sat there until the coffee was cold. The bakery became the heart of Ridgewater. Not the biggest business, not the most profitable, not the kind of establishment that would impress anyone from a city, but the heart. The place where people came not just for bread, but for something harder to name. The warmth of a kitchen that was tended by someone who cared. The smell of good food made by hands that knew what they were doing. The simple pleasure of sitting at a small table and eating something that was made for you personally, by someone who wanted you to be fed. Silas became known. Not as the cattle baron of Iron Ridge, though he still owned the ranch, still managed the business from the small desk Eliza set up in the back room, still rode out every few weeks to check on things, and returned with reports from Walt that were always the same. The cattle were healthy, the crew was solid, and Harlan's cooking was still somewhere in the contested territory between improved and good. He became known as the tall man at the bakery, the one who couldn't make a decent pie to save his life, but who carried flour sacks like they weighed nothing, and who would tell you, without hesitation or tact, exactly what he thought about anything you asked him. People liked him. Not in the way they had feared and respected the Iron Ridge cattle baron, but in the way you like a neighbor who is honest even when honest isn't comfortable. He wasn't perfect. He was never going to be perfect. He still had days when the old coldness crept back, days when he retreated into himself and spoke in monosyllables and ate dinner in silence while Eliza watched him from across the table and waited, without pushing, for him to come back. He lost his temper with suppliers. He argued with the bank. He told Mrs. Shelby that her opinion about rye bread was objectively wrong, and Mrs. Shelby didn't speak to him for 2 weeks. And Eliza had to bake a conciliatory cake and deliver it personally with an apology that Silas had technically authorized but refused to deliver himself because he maintained he had been correct about the rye bread, which he had, but that wasn't the point. Eliza wasn't perfect either. She worked too hard. She forgot to eat. The same old habit, the same standing up in the kitchen, scraps between tasks pattern that Silas had noticed at Iron Ridge, and that he now addressed by physically placing a plate in front of her at regular intervals and standing there until she sat down. She worried about her mother, even though Clara was better, even though the coughing had receded to an occasional rasp that Dr. Calloway said was permanent but not dangerous. She lay awake some nights and listened to the sounds of the town settling into sleep and wondered if all of this, the bakery, the marriage, the life she had built from flour and stubbornness, was solid enough to last, or whether it would crack, the way pie crust cracks when the heat is uneven and the dough has been handled too much. But it held. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Because every morning Eliza woke up and made bread. And every morning Silas woke up and carried flour. And every morning Clara came downstairs and drank coffee and complained about the weather and told Silas his biscuits were substandard. And every morning the bell above the bakery door chimed and someone walked in and smelled sourdough and felt, for a moment, like they'd come home. That was the thing about it, the thing that no one would have predicted, that Eliza herself hadn't predicted, that Silas certainly hadn't predicted when he rode 26 miles with a bad pie on a summer afternoon. The thing that turned out to matter most was not the ranch, or the money, or the cattle, or the land. It was not the grand house on the ridge with its stone walls and its wide windows and its rooms full of expensive furniture. It was this, a small bakery in a small town, with a stove that had a coffee stain on it, and a counter that was too narrow, and a bell that chimed every time someone opened the door. It was the bread. It was always the bread. Clara's recipe, written on the back of a seed catalog page in handwriting that was fading now, soft with years of handling, the ink blurred in places where flour-dusted fingers had traced the instructions. Eliza kept it pinned to the wall above the stove, next to Silas's note. This is not charity. This is wages owed. And next to a drawing that Billy Cortez had sent from Iron Ridge, a clumsy pencil sketch of a horse that looked more like a very large dog. But that was, according to Billy, a portrait of Penny, the roan mare whose stone bruise Eliza had found and treated on her first day at the ranch. 3 pieces of paper, a recipe, a note, and a drawing. The whole story, if you knew how to read it. On a fall evening, a year after the bakery opened, Eliza stood at the counter rolling pie crust while Silas swept the floor and Clara sat at her table by the window, drinking tea, watching the street. The light was golden. The air smelled of bread and cinnamon and the particular sweetness that comes into a room when the people in it are where they belong. "Silas?" Eliza said. Your sweeping is terrible. My sweeping is thorough. You're pushing the dirt into the corner. That's not sweeping, that's relocating. I'll relocate it outside in a minute. You said that yesterday. There's a pile in the corner the size of a small animal. Clara looked up from her tea. He swept like that at the wedding, too. I didn't say anything because it was your special day. It wasn't my special day. It was our special day. It was my special day, Clara said. I finally got rid of you. Eliza looked at her mother, thin, sharp, impossible, alive, and at Silas, tall, stubborn, flour-dusted, present, and at the bakery around them, the shelves she had built, the stove she had chosen, the counter she had rolled 10,000 crusts on, the bell above the door that chimed for strangers and friends alike. And she felt the weight of everything that had led her here, the borrowed horse, the 26 miles, the midnight bread, the porch boards, the stone bruise, the letters, the money in the envelope, the terrible pie, the coffee stain that wouldn't come off, and she understood something that she would carry for the rest of her life. The world tells you that fortune is measured in land and cattle and gold. The frontier tells you that survival is what matters, that getting through the day is enough, that you should take what you can hold and hold it tight and not look up from the work long enough to wonder if there's something more. And maybe that's true. For some people, for some lives, maybe getting through the day is enough. But Eliza Ashcroft now, though she still signed the bakery orders with her maiden name because the bakery was a Rowan thing and always would be, Eliza knew better. She knew that the most valuable thing on the frontier was not land or cattle or gold. It was not even survival, though survival mattered, and she had done her share of it. The most valuable thing was simpler than all of that, and harder to find and impossible to buy, no matter how much money you had, or how many cattle you ran, or how big your house was. It was finding the person who makes even the smallest room feel like enough. She went back to rolling pie crust. Silas went back to relocating dirt. Clara went back to her tea. The bell chimed. Someone walked in. And the bakery, small, imperfect, smelling of bread and cinnamon and the ongoing, ordinary, extraordinary work of building a life, went on.